Hello friends, welcome back to our third lazy history reading. Today we're diving into a fascinating and dark topic about why you wouldn't survive a single day in medieval times. Sounds brutal, right? It definitely makes you wonder how different life really was back then compared to our modern world. But before we start, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Feel free to drop your location in the comments below. It truly brings me joy knowing people from all over the world tune into these videos to relax and unwind. I hope you find this journey through medieval hardships both educational and eye-opening. Alright, let's begin our reading. Imagine waking up tomorrow morning not in your comfortable bed, but on a pile of straw in a one-room hut that you share with your entire family and your livestock. The smell hits you first, a mixture of human waste, animal dung, rotting food, and unwashed bodies that have never known soap. There's no bathroom, no running water, no electricity, and definitely no morning coffee. Welcome to medieval times where life was nasty, brutish, and shockingly short. You think you could handle it? You think you're tough enough to survive in an era when people considered bathing dangerous and believed that bad smells could cure disease? Think again. Today, we're diving deep into the horrifying reality of medieval life, a world so brutal, so unsanitary, and so utterly hostile to human survival that most of you wouldn't last 24 hours. This isn't about knight in shining armor or romantic castle life. This is about the 85% of the population who were peasants, living in conditions that would make a modern prison seem luxurious. We're going to explore every aspect of medieval life that would kill you from the moment you wake up until the moment you die, which statistically speaking, would happen much sooner than you think. We'll cover the diseases that would destroy you, the laws that would execute you for crimes you didn't even know existed, and the social systems that would crush your spirit long before they crushed your body. But first, let's establish just how different medieval life was from anything you've ever experienced. The average medieval peasant worked 16 hours a day during harvest season, slept on moldy straw, ate the same monotonous gruel for months at a time, and lived in constant fear of starvation, disease, violence, and death. They had no concept of privacy, personal hygiene, individual rights, or leisure time. The medieval worldview was fundamentally different from ours. People believed that disease was caused by God's wrath or demonic possession. They thought that the earth was flat and that the stars controlled human destiny. They accepted that most children would die before reaching adulthood and that women were inherently inferior to men. They lived in a world where superstition replaced science, where might made right, and where suffering was seen as the natural condition of humanity. Life expectancy tells the whole story. If you were lucky enough to survive birth, and roughly 30% of babies didn't, you could expect to live to maybe 35 years old if you were a peasant, 45 if you were a noble. But these numbers are misleading because they include infant mortality. If you survived to age 10, you might live to 50, but every year of that life would be filled with hardships that would crush the spirit of any modern person. The medieval calendar was defined not by holidays and vacation time, but by cycles of planting and harvest, fasting and feast, epidemic and recovery. People measured their lives not in achievements and experiences, but in simple survival from one season to the next. So buckle up, because we are about to take a journey through one of the most dangerous periods in human history, and by the end of this, you'll be kissing the ground you walk on in the 21st century. Chapter 1. Your medieval home, a death trap disguised as shelter. Let's start with where you live, if you can even call it living. Your typical medieval peasant home was a single-room hovel made of whatever materials were available locally. In England, this meant wattle and daub, essentially a wooden frame filled with a mixture of mud, animal dung, and straw. The walls were maybe 6 feet high, constructed by weaving thin branches between vertical posts and then coating the whole structure with a mixture that was 1 part clay, 1 part cow manure, and 1 part chopped straw. The roof was thatched with more straw, which sounds cozy until you realize it was a perfect home for rats, insects, and every parasite imaginable. The thatch had to be at least a foot thick to keep out rain, but it was never completely waterproof. During heavy storms, water would drip through constantly, turning the dirt floor into a muddy swamp. Speaking of the floor, there was no wooden flooring, no stone, no tiles. Just packed earth, sometimes mixed with clay if you were fortunate. This dirt floor would be covered with rushes or straw that served as carpet, bedding, and garbage disposal system all in one. These floor coverings were changed maybe once or twice a year, creating a festering carpet of rotting organic matter mixed with food scraps, animal waste, human bodily fluids, and everything else that fell or was spilled during daily life. Archaeologists who have excavated medieval peasant homes have found floor layers containing chicken bones, fish scales, vegetable peelings, broken pottery, lost tools, children's toys, and yes, human feces. All of this was compressed into layers that tell the story of medieval domestic life in the most revolting way possible. But here's where it gets really fun. You didn't live alone in this delightful space. Your medieval home was shared with your entire extended family and your livestock. That's right, your cows, pigs, chickens, and goats all lived in the same room as you and your children. A typical peasant cottage would be divided into two main areas, about 2/3 for the human family and 1/3 for the animals, separated by nothing more than a low wooden fence or wattle barrier. The animals weren't just visitors, they were permanent residents. During winter, having them inside was essential for survival. Their body heat helped warm the space, and their valuable lives needed protection from thieves and predators. But this meant you were constantly breathing in animal dander, dealing with the overwhelming smell of their waste, and sharing your living space with all the diseases and parasites they carried. The medieval family unit was much larger than modern families. A typical household might include grandparents, parents, children, unmarried siblings, and various other relatives who had nowhere else to go. Add in the occasional guest or hired worker, and you might have 10-15 people crammed into a space that was roughly 400 square feet. Privacy was a concept that simply didn't exist. Everything happened in full view of everyone else: birth, death, illness, intimate moments, arguments, celebrations, and daily bodily functions. Children grew up witnessing every aspect of adult life, including things that would be considered traumatic by modern standards. Your only source of heat and light was a fire pit in the center of the room. There was no chimney in most peasant homes, just a hole in the roof directly above the fire pit. This meant your house was constantly filled with smoke, which burned your eyes, damaged your lungs, and covered everything in a layer of soot. The smoke was so thick that medieval people often suffered from serious respiratory problems and eye diseases directly caused by living in these smoky environments. Fire pits served multiple purposes: cooking, heating, and light. But maintaining a fire was a constant challenge. Fuel was expensive and hard to come by. Wood had to be gathered from wherever you could find it, and during winter, families would sometimes burn furniture, tools, or even parts of their house structure to stay warm. Going to sleep meant banking the fire carefully so it wouldn't go out completely, because starting a new fire was difficult and time-consuming. Lighting after dark was minimal and precious. Candles were expensive luxuries made from animal fat or beeswax. Most people used rushlights, dried reeds soaked in animal fat that would burn for maybe 20-30 minutes. A typical family might use 1 or 2 rushlights per evening, creating just enough light to see immediate surroundings. Most activities stopped at sunset simply because there wasn't enough light to continue. The lack of windows meant your home was incredibly dark during the day and pitch black at night. Glass was a luxury beyond the reach of common people, so if there were any window openings at all, they were just holes in the wall that could be covered with oiled cloth, animal skins, or wooden shutters. These openings were usually small and few in number, as larger openings would let in rain, snow, and cold air. This perpetual dimness contributed to vitamin D deficiency and a host of health problems. Medieval people often suffered from rickets, bone deformities, and other conditions related to lack of sunlight exposure. The psychological effects of living in constant twilight cannot be overstated. Depression and seasonal affective disorder were common, though not understood or treated. Furniture was minimal and crude. You might have a few 3-legged stools, a rough wooden table made from planks laid across supports, some storage chests or baskets, and basic cooking implements. Everything was handmade by family members or local craftsmen using simple tools. Comfort was never a consideration. Functionality and durability were all that mattered. Your bed was straw on the floor, shared with your entire family and possibly some of the smaller animals. The straw was infested with fleas, lice, and other parasites. The blankets were rough woolen cloth or animal skins that were heavy, scratchy, and rarely washed. Your pillow was a bundle of rags or a small sack stuffed with straw or feathers if you were very fortunate. Sleep was fitful and constantly interrupted. The animals would make noise throughout the night. Family members would cough, snore, and move around. Children would cry. The fire would need tending. Fleas and lice would bite and crawl. The smell would be overwhelming. Rain might drip through the roof. Cold drafts would blow through gaps in the walls. The structural integrity of these homes was questionable at best. Medieval building techniques were primitive, and materials were often green wood that would warp and crack as it dried. Foundations were minimal or non-existent. Walls could collapse without warning, especially during storms or after heavy rains. Roofs could cave in under the weight of snow or during high winds. Fire was a constant threat. The combination of open flames, dry thatch roofing, and wooden construction made house fires frequent and devastating. Many medieval people died in house fires, and entire neighborhoods could burn down when flames spread from house to house. There were no fire departments, no fire suppression systems, and no building codes to prevent disasters. But perhaps the most dangerous aspect of medieval homes was where you couldn't see the microscopic threats. These houses were breeding grounds for bacteria, viruses, parasites, and fungal infections. The combination of poor ventilation, animal waste, rotting organic matter, and overcrowded conditions created perfect environments for disease transmission. The floor rushes harbored countless pathogens. The walls were damp and moldy. The air was thick with dust, smoke, and airborne contaminants. Everything you touched was contaminated with germs that could cause serious illness or death. Water had to be carried from wells, streams, or public sources that were often contaminated. Storage was in wooden buckets or clay vessels that were difficult to keep clean. Most families had to ration water carefully, using it first for drinking and cooking, then for washing dishes, and finally for basic hygiene if there was any left over. Waste disposal was primitive and dangerous. Human waste was collected in chamber pots that were emptied into streets, ditches, or nearby fields. There was no sewage system, no garbage collection, and no understanding of how waste disposal could affect health. The area around most medieval homes was contaminated with human and animal waste that created breeding grounds for disease. Food storage was a constant challenge. Without refrigeration, everything had to be preserved through smoking, salting, drying, or fermentation. Root cellars dug into the ground provided some cool storage, but they were often damp and prone to flooding. Grain was stored in wooden chests or baskets that offered little protection from rodents and insects. Rats and mice were constant companions in medieval homes. They contaminated food supplies, spread diseases, and caused property damage. Cats were kept to control rodent populations, but even the best masters couldn't completely eliminate the problem. Some families kept small dogs for the same purpose, but these animals added to the overcrowding and sanitation problems. The psychological impact of living in such conditions cannot be overstated. The constant stress of overcrowding, the lack of comfort and privacy, the ever-present smells and smoke, and the knowledge that your home could collapse or burn at any moment created chronic anxiety and depression that shortened lives even beyond the physical health threats. For women, the home environment was particularly challenging. They spent most of their time indoors, exposed to the smoke and poor air quality while cooking and managing household tasks. Pregnancy and childbirth in these unsanitary conditions led to high rates of infection and death for both mothers and babies. Children growing up in these environments faced developmental challenges from poor nutrition, constant exposure to toxins, and the stress of overcrowded living conditions. Many developed respiratory problems from smoke exposure, suffered from chronic parasitic infections, and struggled with malnutrition from eating contaminated or inadequate food. The simple act of cooking was fraught with danger. Open fires in enclosed spaces led to frequent burns and house fires. Cooking pots were made of clay or crude metal that could crack or break, spilling boiling liquids and causing serious injuries. Food preparation without proper sanitation caused constant stomach ailments and food poisoning. Even something as basic as getting dressed was complicated by medieval living conditions. Clothes were stored in chests that were often damp and moldy. Getting clean clothes was impossible, as washing was infrequent and difficult. Most people owned only 1 or 2 sets of clothing that were worn constantly until they fell apart. Personal hygiene was almost non-existent. Bathing was rare and considered unhealthy by many people. Teeth were never brushed. Hair was rarely washed. Bodies were never properly cleaned. The smell inside a medieval home was overwhelming by modern standards, but people became accustomed to it because they had no alternative. Though a medieval home wasn't a sanctuary or a place of comfort, it was a survival challenge that tested your endurance every single day. The very place meant to protect you from the outside world was slowly killing you from the inside. And this was just the beginning of your daily struggle against the countless dangers of medieval life. Chapter 2: Food and Famine, when your next meal could be your last. Now that we've established that your home was basically a death trap, let's talk about food, or rather, the lack thereof. In medieval times, eating wasn't about pleasure or even adequate nutrition, it was about not dying of starvation. And for most people, that was a daily challenge that consumed their every waking moment. The medieval diet was monotonous, inadequate, and dangerous. For the average peasant, meals consisted mainly of bread, porridge, and whatever vegetables could be grown locally. Meat was a luxury reserved for special occasions, and even then it was often spoiled, diseased, or of questionable origin. Bread was the cornerstone of the medieval diet, making up 70% of daily calories for most people. But this wasn't the fluffy, white bread you're used to. Medieval bread was made from whatever grain was available, wheat if you were incredibly lucky and wealthy, but more often barley, oats, rye, or even beans and peas ground into flour. The bread was dark, coarse, dense, and often contaminated with dirt, insects, stones, and rodent droppings that got mixed in during the growing, harvesting, and grinding process. The quality of medieval bread varied dramatically depending on social status and local conditions. The wealthy might get white bread made from carefully sifted wheat flour, but peasants usually ate dark bread that was barely recognizable as bread by modern standards. Sometimes the grain was so poor that it was mixed with sawdust, crushed acorns, or even clay to make it go further. Making bread was a complex and dangerous process. First, grain had to be ground into flour using stone mills that often left grit and stone particles in the flour. This debris wore down people's teeth and caused serious dental problems. The flour was then mixed with water to make dough, but the water was often contaminated, and the mixing bowls were rarely clean. Baking required access to an oven, which most peasant families didn't have. In many villages there was one communal oven owned by the lord of the manor. Peasants had to pay to use this oven, and they had to wait their turn, sometimes for days. During busy periods like harvest time, families might go without fresh bread for weeks. But here's the really terrifying part: the grain used to make bread was often infected with ergot, a fungus that produced compounds similar to LSD. Ergot contamination caused a condition called St. Anthony's fire, which led to hallucinations, convulsions, gangrene, and death. Entire communities would sometimes be poisoned by ergot-contaminated bread, leading to outbreaks of madness, mass hysteria, and horrific deaths. The symptoms of ergot poisoning were nightmarish. Victims would experience burning sensations in their extremities, followed by gangrene that would cause fingers, toes, hands, and feet to literally fall off. Others would suffer from convulsions so violent that they would break their own bones. Many would hallucinate terrifying visions before dying in agony. What makes this even more horrible is that people had no understanding of what was causing these symptoms. They attributed ergot poisoning to witchcraft, divine punishment, or demonic possession. Communities would sometimes turn on each other, accusing neighbors of casting spells or making deals with the devil, when in reality they were all being slowly poisoned by their daily bread. Vegetables were limited to what could be grown in the local climate and preserved without refrigeration. The medieval vegetable garden was a far cry from modern produce sections. Cabbage, onions, leeks, turnips, carrots, and beans were the most common crops, but they were often small, tough, and bitter compared to modern varieties. These vegetables were typically stored in root cellars, where they would slowly rot or become infested with insects and worms. By late winter and early spring, stored vegetables would be moldy, sprouted, or completely spoiled. People would eat them anyway rather than starve, leading to frequent food poisoning and nutritional deficiencies. Fresh vegetables were only available during the growing season, which was much shorter than in modern agricultural systems. For 6 months or more each year, people had to survive on whatever stored vegetables remained, often eating roots and leaves that were barely recognizable as food. Fruit was even rarer and more seasonal than vegetables. Most medieval people went their entire lives eating fresh fruit only a few times. Apples and pears could be stored for a few months in cold conditions, but they quickly became soft and rotten. Other fruits like berries had to be eaten immediately when ripe or preserved by drying, which removed most of their nutritional value. The preservation of food was a constant struggle against time and decay. Without refrigeration, meat had to be salted, smoked, or dried, processes that didn't always work perfectly and often made the meat nearly inedible. Salt was expensive and often contained impurities that added strange flavors and colors to preserved foods. Smoking meat required constant attention to maintain the right temperature and smoke density. Too little smoke and the meat would spoil. Too much heat and it would cook rather than preserve. The process could take days or weeks, and there was always the risk that something would go wrong and entire supplies would be lost. Salted meat was incredibly tough and salty, requiring hours of soaking before it could be eaten. Even then, it was often so hard that it had to be ground up or boiled into a mush. The salt used for preservation was often contaminated with sand, dirt, and other impurities that added to the unpleasant texture and taste. But the real horror of medieval eating wasn't just the poor quality of food, it was the constant threat of famine. Crop failures due to bad weather, plant diseases, or insect infestations could mean starvation for entire regions. The Great Famine of 1350-1322 killed between 10-25% of the population in northern Europe. People literally starved to death in the streets while others watched helplessly. The psychological impact of this famine was devastating. Contemporary chronicles describe people eating bark from trees, grass from fields, and leather from shoes and belts. Some resorted to eating clay, hoping it would fill their stomachs even though it provided no nutrition. Others turned to eating things that weren't food at all: sawdust, animal droppings, and even poisonous plants that they knew might kill them but hoped might provide some sustenance. During the worst famines, cannibalism became a reality that medieval chroniclers documented with horror. Parents were forced to make unthinkable choices about which children to feed and which to abandon. Some families would send their weakest members away to die alone rather than watch them starve slowly. Markets sold human flesh alongside what little animal meat was available. The social breakdown during famines was complete and terrifying. Normal moral codes disappeared when people were dying of hunger. Theft of food became punishable by immediate execution, but people still risked death to steal a single loaf of bread. Children were abandoned by parents who couldn't feed them. The elderly were left to die so that younger family members might survive. Even in normal years, the threat of famine was never far away. Medieval agriculture was primitive and unreliable. A single hailstone could destroy an entire year's crop. Too much rain could cause grain to rot in the fields. Too little rain could cause drought and crop failure. Insect swarms could eat entire harvests in days. There was no way to predict or prevent these agricultural disasters, and no way to import food from distant regions when local crops failed. Communities were entirely dependent on what they could grow themselves, and when that failed, they faced starvation with no hope of relief. The preparation of food was almost as dangerous as finding it. Cooking was done over open fires using crude utensils made of wood or poorly forged metal. Burns were common and often serious. House fires started by cooking accidents killed thousands of people every year. Cooking pots made of clay could crack and spill boiling liquids, causing severe injuries. Food storage was primitive and ineffective. Grain was kept in wooden containers that offered little protection from rodents, insects, and moisture. Rats and mice contaminated food supplies with their droppings and urine, spreading diseases like the plague. Weevils and other insects infested stored grain, making it barely edible even when it didn't cause illness. The seasonal nature of food availability created a yearly cycle of plenty and want that dominated medieval life. Even in good years, the period between the end of winter food stores and the new harvest, called the Hunger Gap, was a time of severe food shortages. People would lose significant weight during these periods, and many would die from malnutrition-related diseases. The lack of understanding about nutrition meant that even when food was available, people's diets were severely imbalanced. Protein deficiency was common, leading to kwashiorkor, muscle wasting, and developmental problems in children. Iron deficiency caused anemia, making people weak and susceptible to other illnesses. Vitamin deficiencies led to scurvy, rickets, and other diseases that modern nutrition could easily prevent. Children suffered the most from poor nutrition. Many were permanently stunted by malnutrition, never reaching their full growth potential. Pregnant and nursing mothers often couldn't get adequate nutrition, leading to high rates of infant and maternal mortality. Children who survived infancy often bore the physical and cognitive effects of chronic malnutrition throughout their lives. Water, as we mentioned, was often contaminated and dangerous to drink. People knew that water from certain sources made them sick, but they didn't understand why or how to make it safe. Wells were often contaminated by human waste, animal carcasses, and other pollutants. Rivers and streams served as both water sources and sewage disposal systems. The alcoholic beverages that people drank instead of water were low in alcohol content but still contained enough ethanol to kill some bacteria. However, these drinks were often made from contaminated ingredients and could cause their own health problems. The brewing process was unsanitary, and storage conditions allowed harmful organisms to multiply. Beer and ale were often the only safe liquids available, so even children drank them regularly. This meant that entire populations lived in a state of mild but constant intoxication, which affected their ability to work, think clearly, and make good decisions. Alcohol-related accidents, violence, and health problems were common consequences of this enforced drinking culture. Dairy products, when available, were often spoiled or contaminated. Milk went bad quickly without refrigeration, and there was no way to test whether it was safe to drink. Cheese and butter were made in unsanitary conditions using unpasteurized milk from diseased animals. These products could transmit tuberculosis, brucellosis, and other serious diseases. The animals that provided dairy products were often sick themselves. Medieval livestock suffered from various diseases that could be transmitted to humans through milk and meat. There were no veterinarians, no animal health inspections, and no understanding of how animal diseases could affect human health. Meat, when it was available, came from animals that were often diseased, malnourished, or contaminated. Slaughter was performed without sanitary precautions, and there was no inspection system to ensure meat safety. Spoiled meat was common, and people often ate it anyway rather than waste precious protein. The spice trade, which drove much of medieval commerce, existed partly because spices could hide the taste and smell of spoiled food. Pepper, cinnamon, and other spices were worth their weight in gold because they made rotten meat and spoiled vegetables palatable. But spices were expensive and available only to the wealthy. Common people had to eat this spoiled food without any flavoring to mask the awful taste. Cooking methods were limited and often made food less nutritious rather than more so. Boiling was the most common cooking technique, but it leached vitamins and minerals from vegetables. Roasting over open fires often resulted in food that was burned on the outside and raw on the inside. There was no understanding of food safety temperatures or proper cooking techniques. The psychological stress of never knowing where your next meal would come from created chronic anxiety that affected both physical and mental health. The constant hunger experienced by most medieval people would have been unbearable by modern standards. People planned their entire lives around the search for food, and every decision was influenced by the need to avoid starvation. Food-related social hierarchies meant that the best food went to the nobility and clergy, while peasants subsisted on scraps and leftovers. During times of shortage, the poor were the first to starve while the wealthy continued to feast. This created resentment and social tension that sometimes exploded into violence and revolution. Even the wealthy weren't immune to food-related dangers. Rich people often suffered from gout and other diseases caused by eating too much rich food and drinking too much alcohol. Their elaborate feasts could last for days, but they were often followed by periods of digestive problems and illness caused by overeating and consuming spoiled luxury foods. The medieval attitude toward food was fundamentally different from ours. Food was scarce, precious, and never taken for granted. Every meal could be your last, and every bite was a victory against starvation. This created a relationship with food based on desperation rather than pleasure, a constant reminder that you were always just one crop failure away from death. Chapter 3, Disease and Medicine, where cures were more deadly than the diseases. If the housing didn't kill you and the food didn't poison you, don't worry, medieval medicine would finish the job. Welcome to an era where the cure was almost always worse than the disease, where doctors believed that bad smells could heal you, and where surgery was performed with the same tools used to slaughter animals. Life expectancy in medieval times was brutally short, and disease was the biggest killer. If you were lucky enough to survive birth, and that was a big if, with infant mortality rates around 30%, you could expect to live to maybe 30–35 years old if you were a peasant. Even nobles, with access to the best medical care available, rarely lived past 50. The idea of retirement, of growing old gracefully, of seeing grandchildren grow up, these were luxuries that medieval people couldn't even imagine. Disease was everywhere, and it was creative in its methods of killing you. The Black Death, which swept through Europe in the 14th century, killed between 30 and 60% of the population. But plague was just one of many killers stalking medieval communities. Let's take a tour through the disease landscape that would have been your daily reality. Tuberculosis, which medieval people called consumption, was perhaps the most feared disease because of how it killed its victims. The disease would slowly waste away its victims over months or years, causing them to cough up blood, lose dramatic amounts of weight, and eventually die in agony. The disease was incredibly contagious but poorly understood. Victims would be isolated from their families, left to die alone while their loved ones watched helplessly through windows and doorways. Entire families would be wiped out as tuberculosis passed from person to person in their crowded, poorly ventilated homes. Children would watch their parents waste away, knowing that they were likely next. The psychological trauma of living with consumption was almost as devastating as the physical symptoms. The medieval understanding of tuberculosis was completely wrong and often harmful. Doctors believed the disease was caused by corrupted air or evil vapors, leading to treatments that actually made patients worse. They would prescribe bloodletting to weaken already frail patients, or recommend exposure to good air that often meant sitting in cold, damp conditions that accelerated the disease's progress. Dysentery, caused by contaminated water and poor sanitation, killed through violent diarrhea and dehydration. The disease was so common that medieval people accepted it as a normal part of life, like catching a cold. But dysentery could kill within days, especially in children and elderly people whose bodies couldn't handle the rapid fluid loss. The constant presence of human waste in streets and water sources meant that dysentery epidemics swept through communities regularly. During outbreaks, entire households would be struck down simultaneously, leaving no one healthy enough to care for the sick. People would die of dehydration while lying in their own waste, too weak to call for help that probably wouldn't have come anyway. Medieval treatments for dysentery were not only useless, but often fatal. Doctors would prescribe more bloodletting to drain the corrupted humors, or give patients powerful purgatives that caused even more fluid loss. Some physicians recommended drinking wine mixed with crushed pearls or gold dust, expensive remedies that did nothing except bankrupt families while their loved ones died. Typhus, spread by lice and fleas, thrived in the unsanitary conditions of medieval life. The disease caused high fever, severe headaches, and a characteristic rash before killing its victims through organ failure. Since personal hygiene was poor and people rarely washed their clothes or bedding, everyone was infested with the insects that spread the disease. The medieval response to typhus outbreaks was to increase religious observances, believing that God was punishing the community for its sins. This meant more crowded church services where the disease could spread even faster. Some communities would organize mass processions where hundreds of infected people would march through the streets, spreading lice and disease to everyone they encountered. Typhus was particularly devastating during times of war, when soldiers lived in close quarters under terrible conditions. Entire armies would be decimated by typhus outbreaks, often losing more men to disease than to enemy action. The disease was sometimes Cold War fever because it seemed to follow military campaigns across Europe. Smallpox left survivors horribly scarred and often blind. The disease was highly contagious and had a mortality rate of about 30%. Those lucky enough to survive were marked for life with deep pockmarks that made them easily identifiable as smallpox survivors. These scars were not just cosmetic, they often indicated damage to the underlying tissue that could cause ongoing health problems. Medieval people believed that smallpox was caused by corrupt blood and would attempt to treat it by making small cuts in the patient's skin to let the bad blood escape. This practice, called scarification, often led to secondary infections that killed patients who might have survived the original disease. The social stigma attached to smallpox survivors was severe. Many people believed that the scars indicated moral corruption or divine displeasure. Survivors often found it difficult to marry or find employment, leading to lives of poverty and social isolation that compounded the trauma of surviving the disease. But it wasn't just epidemic diseases that killed medieval people. Ordinary infections that we treat easily today were death sentences. A simple cut from a farming tool could become infected and lead to sepsis and death within days. Broken bones that didn't heal properly could cause lifelong disability or fatal complications when bone fragments pierced internal organs. The medieval understanding of infection was non-existent. People had no concept of germs or bacteria, so they had no idea why wounds sometimes festered and killed. They would often pack infected wounds with materials that made the infection worse: animal dung, spider webs, moldy bread, and other substances that introduced more harmful bacteria. Some medieval treatments for infected wounds were so harmful that they guaranteed death. Physicians would cauterize wounds with red-hot irons, destroying healthy tissue along with infected areas. Others would apply caustic substances like quicklime or acid that burned away flesh and bone. Many patients died from the shock and trauma of these treatments rather than from their original injuries. Childbirth was particularly dangerous for women, with maternal mortality rates that would be shocking by modern standards. Without understanding of sterile technique, basic anatomy, or the mechanics of labor and delivery, midwives often cause more harm than good. Estimates suggest that between 10 and 20% of all women died in childbirth, making pregnancy a potentially fatal condition. Medieval obstetric practices were based on superstition rather than medical knowledge. Midwives would place religious relics on laboring women, give them toxic herbal concoctions, or perform painful and dangerous procedures that increase the risk of infection and death. Breech births, prolonged labor, and other complications that are manageable today were automatic death sentences for both mother and child. The social implications of maternal mortality were devastating. Children who lost their mothers in infancy had little chance of survival, as there were no adequate substitutes for breast milk. Families were torn apart by maternal death, and communities lost their most productive members during their peak childbearing years. Infant mortality was even worse than maternal mortality. Roughly half of all children died before their 5th birthday, and many more died before reaching adulthood. The causes were numerous: birth trauma, infections, congenital defects that would be easily treatable today, accidents, malnutrition, and simple neglect. Many babies were accidentally smothered while sleeping with their parents in overcrowded beds, a practice called overlaying that was so common it had its own legal category. Parents would wake up to find their infants dead, crushed beneath the weight of adults who had rolled over in their sleep. This tragedy was repeated thousands of times every year across medieval Europe. Medieval medical knowledge was a dangerous mix of ancient Greek theories, religious superstition, and folk remedies that were often more harmful than helpful. The dominant medical theory was based on the 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Doctors believed that illness was caused by an imbalance of these humors, and treatments were designed to restore balance through methods that often killed patients. Bloodletting was the most common medical procedure, used to treat everything from headaches to plague. Doctors would cut veins or use leeches to drain excess blood from patients, often weakening them so much that they died from blood loss rather than their original illness. The amount of blood removed was sometimes enormous, up to half of the patient's total blood volume. The tools used for bloodletting were crude and unsanitary. Knives, razors, and sharpened metal implements would be used on multiple patients without any cleaning or sterilization. This spread diseases like hepatitis and syphilis from patient to patient, creating epidemics of blood-borne illnesses that physicians couldn't understand or prevent. Purging, forcing patients to vomit or have diarrhea, was another standard treatment. Doctors would give patients toxic substances like mercury, antimony, or plant extracts that cause violent illness. The theory was that vomiting and diarrhea would expel disease from the body, but in reality, these treatments often caused dehydration, poisoning, and death. The substances used for purging were often more dangerous than the diseases they were meant to treat. Mercury caused neurological damage, kidney failure, and death. Antimony was a poison that could kill in small doses. Many plant extracts used as purgatives contained toxic alkaloids that caused hallucinations, convulsions, and organ failure. Surgery, when it was attempted at all, was performed without anesthesia, antiseptic technique, or proper anatomical knowledge. Surgeons, who were often the same people who cut hair and pulled teeth, would use unsterilized instruments in filthy conditions. The mortality rate for surgical procedures was close to 100%. Medieval surgical tools were crude and multifunctional. The same knife might be used to cut hair, trim fingernails, and perform surgery. Saws used for carpentry were employed to amputate limbs. Needles used for sewing clothes were used to suture wounds. None of these tools were designed for medical use, and none were properly sterilized. Amputation was sometimes necessary for severe injuries, but without anesthesia or proper technique, most patients died from shock, blood loss, or infection. Those who survived were left disabled in a world that had no accommodation for people with disabilities. Artificial limbs were crude wooden attachments that were more hindrance than help. The social stigma attached to physical disability was severe in medieval society. Disabled people were often seen as being punished by God for their sins or their ancestors' sins. They had difficulty finding work, forming relationships, or participating in community life. Many became beggars or died from neglect and poverty. Dental care was primitive and agonizing. Tooth extraction was performed without pain relief using crude tools like pliers, hammers, and chisels. Dental infections were common and often spread to cause fatal brain abscesses or sepsis. Many people lost all their teeth by middle age, making it impossible to eat properly and contributing to malnutrition. Medieval dental practices were based more on superstition than medical knowledge. Toothache was thought to be caused by tooth worms that had to be removed by drilling holes in the teeth. This procedure, performed with crude hand tools, often destroyed healthy teeth and caused massive infections. The lack of adequate nutrition meant that medieval people's teeth were already weakened by malnutrition and vitamin deficiencies. Poor dental hygiene, combined with diets high in coarse grains that wore down tooth enamel, created a perfect storm of oral health problems that afflicted almost everyone. Mental illness was completely misunderstood and often attributed to demon possession, divine punishment, or supernatural causes. People with mental health problems were ostracized, abused, imprisoned, or killed. There was no concept of psychological treatment, therapy, or compassionate care for those suffering from mental disorders. Medieval treatments for mental illness were cruel and often fatal. Patients might be beaten to drive out demons, starved to purify their souls, or subjected to exorcism rituals that involved physical torture. Some were chained in dungeons or abandoned in forests to die. The lucky ones were simply ignored and left to fend for themselves. The medical profession itself was largely unregulated and unscientific. Anyone could claim to be a doctor, and many medical practitioners had no training whatsoever. Even those who had some education were working with fundamentally incorrect theories about how the human body worked. Medical schools, where they existed, focused on studying ancient texts rather than observing actual patients or conducting experiments. Students learned to recite Greek and Roman medical theories, but gained no practical experience with diagnosis or treatment. This created a medical profession that was confident but completely incompetent. The cost of medical care was astronomical, making it available only to the wealthy. A single consultation with a physician could cost more than a peasant family's annual income. This meant that most people had to rely on folk remedies, religious healing, or simply hope that they would recover on their own. Folk remedies were sometimes effective as they were based on centuries of trial and error with natural substances. However, they were mixed with dangerous superstitions and ineffective treatments that could make conditions worse. The lack of standardization meant that the same remedy could vary dramatically in potency and effectiveness. Medications were often more poisonous than helpful. Mercury, lead, arsenic, and other toxic substances were commonly prescribed for various conditions. Many medicines were made from animal parts, human waste, and poisonous plants. The lack of quality control meant that even potentially helpful substances were often contaminated or administered in dangerous doses. The medieval pharmacopoeia included substances that would horrify modern patients. Crushed human skulls were prescribed for epilepsy. Urine was recommended for various skin conditions. Powdered unicorn horn, actually narwhal tusk, was sold as a cure-all for poison. These expensive and useless remedies bankrupt families while providing no medical benefit. Hospitals, run by religious orders, were places where people went to die rather than to be cured. They were overcrowded, unsanitary, and staffed by people with no medical training. Patients with different diseases were mixed together, ensuring that infection spread rapidly through the facility. Medieval hospitals were more like hostels than medical facilities. They provided shelter and basic care for the poor and dying, but no actual medical treatment. Patients would lie on straw mattresses in large dormitory-style rooms, sharing space and air with people suffering from every imaginable disease. The concept of contagion was poorly understood, leading to practices that spread disease rather than containing it. Sick and healthy people would share beds, eating utensils, and personal items. Infected bandages and clothing were reused without cleaning. Medical personnel moved from patient to patient without washing their hands or changing their clothes. Pregnancy and childbirth were surrounded by superstition and dangerous practices that increased mortality rates for both mothers and babies. Pregnant women were regularly bled, given toxic medications, and subjected to procedures that often caused miscarriage or maternal death. The high rate of infant mortality was accepted as cause rather than a medical problem that could be solved. Medieval obstetric beliefs included the idea that labor pains were punishment for Eve's sin and that women should suffer during childbirth as divine retribution. This led to resistance to any attempts to reduce pain or make delivery safer. Pain relief was seen as interfering with God's plan and was often forbidden. The tools and techniques used in difficult births were crude and dangerous. Sharp hooks were used to extract dead babies, often causing severe trauma to the mother. Faucets hadn't been invented, so breech births and other complications usually resulted in the death of both mother and child. Anatomical knowledge was severely limited because dissection of human bodies was forbidden by the Church for most of the medieval period. When dissections were finally allowed, they were performed on executed criminals and were more ceremonial than scientific. Medical students watched from a distance while a barber surgeon did the actual cutting, learning nothing about human anatomy. This lack of anatomical knowledge meant that physicians had no understanding of how organs functioned or how diseases affected different body systems. They couldn't locate major organs, didn't understand circulation, and had no concept of how infections spread through the body. The few anatomical texts that existed were based on dissections of animals, particularly pigs, rather than humans. This led to fundamental misunderstandings about human anatomy that persisted for centuries. Medical students learned that humans had multiple chambers in their hearts like pigs, or that the liver was located on the right side like in cattle. Epidemic diseases could wipe out entire communities within weeks or months. The combination of poor sanitation, overcrowding, malnutrition, and lack of effective medical treatment created perfect conditions for disease outbreaks. When plague, typhus, or other epidemic diseases arrived in a community, there was little anyone could do except pray and hope to survive. The social and economic disruption caused by epidemics was devastating. Entire families would die, leaving orphan children to fend for themselves. Businesses collapsed when owners and workers died. Agricultural production stopped when farmers were too sick to work. Trade routes were abandoned when merchants and travelers died en route. The psychological impact of living in constant fear of disease created a fatalistic attitude toward health and life that pervaded medieval society. People accepted that death could come at any moment from causes they couldn't understand or prevent. This fatalism may have helped them cope with the constant threat of disease, but it also prevented them from taking actions that might have improved their health and longevity. Religious responses to disease often made medical problems worse rather than better. Mass gatherings for prayer and penance created opportunities for diseases to spread. Flagellant movements, where people whipped themselves to atone for sins, caused injuries that became infected. Pilgrimages to holy sites spread diseases across long distances as infected travelers carried illnesses to new communities. The medieval understanding of disease causation was so flawed that people often blamed the victims for their own illnesses. Disease was seen as punishment for sin, evidence of moral corruption, or the result of bad behavior. This victim-blaming mentality made medical treatment even more harmful, as physicians would focus on correcting the patient's supposed moral failings rather than treating the actual disease. Lepers were perhaps the most severely stigmatized disease victims in medieval society. Leprosy, now known as Hansen's disease, was poorly understood and greatly feared. People with leprosy were forced to live in isolated colonies, ring bells to warn others of their approach, and were essentially treated as if they were already dead. Many were forced to attend their own funeral services before being banished from society forever. The medieval response to leprosy was based entirely on religious and social prejudice rather than medical understanding. Lepers were required to wear distinctive clothing, usually a grey or brown robe with a hood that concealed their faces. They couldn't enter churches, markets, taverns, or any public spaces. They couldn't touch healthy people or even objects that healthy people might later touch. But here's the truly tragic part: many people diagnosed with leprosy probably didn't have the disease at all. Medieval physicians couldn't distinguish between leprosy and other skin conditions like eczema, psoriasis, or even the effects of malnutrition and poor hygiene. Countless people were condemned to living death based on misdiagnosis and ignorance. The social isolation imposed on lepers was so complete that many died not from the disease itself, but from starvation, exposure, and despair. Leper colonies were usually located in remote, inhospitable areas with minimal resources. The inhabitants were expected to support themselves through begging or whatever work they could manage, but they were forbidden from approaching potential benefactors. Even more disturbing was the treatment of people with mental illness, epilepsy, or developmental disabilities. These conditions were universally attributed to demonic possession, divine punishment, or moral corruption. Treatments included exorcism rituals that often involved physical torture, starvation to purify the soul, and confinement in conditions that would break the spirit of a healthy person. The medieval understanding of epilepsy was particularly harmful. Seizures were seen as evidence of possession by evil spirits, and epileptics were often subjected to violent exorcism rituals that could kill them. Some were tied down during seizures in ways that caused suffocation or broken bones. Others were given medicines containing toxic substances that made their conditions worse. People with what we would now recognize as mental illness faced similar horrors. Depression was seen as spiritual weakness or lack of faith. Anxiety disorders were attributed to demonic influence. Schizophrenia and other psychotic conditions were clear evidence of possession that required violent intervention to save the victim's soul. The treatments for mental illness were designed to drive out demons or punish the sufferer for their supposed sins. Patients were beaten, starved, exposed to extreme temperatures, and subjected to various forms of torture that were justified as medical treatment. Many died from these cures rather than from their original conditions. But even physical illnesses that we understand today were subject to dangerous and useless treatments based on medieval medical theories. Take arthritis, which was common among people who did heavy manual labor their entire lives. Medieval physicians believed arthritis was caused by cold and moist humors that had settled in the joints. The prescribed treatment was to heat the affected areas using red-hot irons, boiling water, or caustic chemicals. Patients would be burned so severely that they developed infections that often proved fatal. The lucky ones were merely left with permanent scarring and disability. The unlucky ones died from sepsis caused by the treatment. Kidney stones, which were relatively common due to poor diet and contaminated water, were another condition that medieval medicine made worse rather than better. Physicians believed stones were caused by crystallized humors that could be dissolved by drinking various toxic concoctions. Patients with kidney stones were given mercury, lead compounds, and other poisonous substances that caused additional organ damage. Some were subjected to primitive surgical procedures performed without anesthesia or antiseptic technique. The mortality rate for kidney stone surgery was close to 100%, as patients died from shock, blood loss, or infection. Eye diseases were incredibly common in medieval times, partly due to vitamin A deficiency and partly due to constant exposure to smoke from cooking fires. Blindness was so prevalent that most communities had significant populations of blind people who survived through begging or performing simple tasks. Medieval treatments for eye conditions were not just useless but actively harmful. Physicians would place various substances directly on the eyes, including ground glass, powdered metals, and animal waste. These treatments often caused additional damage that worsened or caused blindness in people who might have recovered naturally. Cataract surgery was attempted using crude knives to cut into the eye and push the clouded lens aside. This procedure was performed without anesthesia on fully conscious patients who were held down by assistants. Most patients lost their sight entirely, and many died from infections that spread to the brain. Skin diseases were common and poorly understood. Conditions like scabies, ringworm, and various bacterial infections were treated with caustic substances that burned away healthy skin along with infected tissue. Patients were often left with permanent scarring and disfigurement that was worse than their original conditions. The medieval obsession with bloodletting extended to skin conditions, with physicians believing that skin problems were caused by corrupt blood that needed to be drained. Patients with minor skin irritations would be subjected to extensive bloodletting that left them weak and anemic while their skin conditions remained unchanged. Venereal diseases, which were becoming more common as trade and travel increased, were seen as just punishment for immoral behavior. Rather than attempting to treat these conditions medically, physicians focused on punishing patients for their supposed sins. Treatments involved painful and useless procedures designed more to cause suffering than to provide healing. The stigma associated with venereal diseases meant that many people avoided seeking any treatment at all, allowing conditions to progress to advanced stages that caused blindness, insanity, and death. The medieval medical establishment was more concerned with moral judgment than healing, creating barriers to treatment that made public health problems worse. Respiratory diseases, which were extremely common due to poor air quality and crowded living conditions, were treated with methods that often made breathing problems worse. Patients with asthma or other lung conditions were subjected to bloodletting that weakened their already compromised systems. Steam treatments involved exposing patients to various toxic vapors that were supposed to cleanse the lungs. These treatments often included mercury vapor, burning sulfur, or other substances that caused additional lung damage. Many patients died from poisoning rather than from their original respiratory conditions. The medieval period also saw the beginning of more systematic persecution of people accused of witchcraft, and medical conditions often played a role in these accusations. Women who displayed symptoms of mental illness, epilepsy, or even unusual physical conditions could find themselves accused of making pacts with the devil. The connection between medicine and witchcraft accusations was particularly strong regarding reproductive health. Women who experienced miscarriages, stillbirths, or infant deaths could be accused of practicing witchcraft. Midwives who attended difficult births were sometimes blamed when things went wrong and could face accusations of using evil magic. The witch trial process itself was medically dangerous. Accused witches were subjected to various tests that could cause serious injury or death. Water trials involved throwing bound suspects into bodies of water, where they would drown if innocent or be executed if they survived. The medical examination of accused witches looking for devil's marks often involved painful procedures that left permanent damage. Even common childhood diseases that we now prevent with vaccines were devastating in medieval times. Measles, mumps, and whooping cough killed thousands of children every year. Parents would watch helplessly as their children died from diseases that medieval medicine was powerless to treat or prevent. The medieval response to childhood diseases was largely fatalistic. High infant and child mortality rates were accepted as normal, and families learned not to become too attached to young children who were likely to die. This created a psychological distance between parents and children that affected family relationships throughout medieval society. Medical education, such as it existed, was based on memorizing ancient texts rather than observing patients or conducting experiments. Medical students spent years learning to recite Greek and Roman theories without ever examining a living person or witnessing actual medical procedures. Few medical schools that existed were more concerned with philosophical debates about the nature of illness than with practical healing. Students learned elaborate theories about how diseases were supposed to work according to ancient authorities, but gained no hands-on experience that might have taught them how to help actual patients. This educational system produced physicians who were confident in their theoretical knowledge but completely incompetent when faced with real medical problems. They could discourse eloquently about the balance of humors but couldn't recognize or treat common conditions that kill their patients regularly. The licensing of medical practitioners was minimal and inconsistent. While some regions attempted to regulate who could practice medicine, enforcement was weak and standards were low. Many physicians had no formal training whatsoever and learned their trade through apprenticeships with other untrained practitioners. This lack of regulation meant that medieval medicine was practiced by everyone from university-educated scholars to village-wise women to complete charlatans who preyed on desperate patients. The quality of medical care varied enormously, but even the best trained physicians were working with fundamentally incorrect theories that made their treatments harmful rather than helpful. The cost of medical care was so high that it was available only to the wealthy, but this may actually have been fortunate for the poor. Those who couldn't afford physicians had to rely on folk remedies and home treatments that, while often ineffective, were usually less dangerous than professional medical intervention. Folk medicine included many practices that were actually harmful, but it also preserved some treatments that had genuine therapeutic value. Herbal remedies, while often prepared and administered incorrectly, sometimes contained active compounds that could help certain conditions. However, these potentially useful treatments were mixed with dangerous superstitions and practices that could make conditions worse. The medieval period represents one of the darkest chapters in the history of medicine. The combination of ignorance, superstition, and systematic malpractice created a medical system that was more likely to kill patients than cure them. For most medieval people, their best chance of surviving illness was to avoid physicians entirely and hope that their body's natural healing processes would be sufficient. Chapter 4: Laws and Justice, where justice was anything but just. Think modern legal systems are unfair. Medieval law would make you long for the good old days of parking tickets and jury duty. Welcome to a world where you could be executed for stealing a loaf of bread, where your guilt or innocence was determined by whether you sank when thrown into water, and where the punishment for most crimes was designed to be as publicly humiliating and painful as possible. Medieval legal systems varied by region, but they all shared certain characteristics that would terrify any modern person who values due process or human rights. The concept of innocent until proven guilty didn't exist. Justice was swift, brutal, and often completely arbitrary, based more on social status, personal relationships, and the whims of local authorities than on any consistent application of legal principles. Let's start with some of the bizarre laws that could get you killed. In medieval England, it was illegal for peasants to wear certain colors or types of clothing. Purple and ermine were reserved for royalty, and wearing them if you weren't noble could result in severe punishment, including death. These sumptuary laws were incredibly detailed, specifying exactly what fabrics, colors, and styles each social class was permitted to wear. The enforcement of clothing laws was arbitrary and often corrupt. A peasant might wear a piece of fine clothing given to them by an employer or found second-hand, only to be arrested and punished for dressing above their station. Local officials could use these laws to harass people they disliked or to extort bribes from anyone whose clothing seemed too fine for their social position. Similarly, there were laws governing what foods different social classes were allowed to eat. A peasant caught eating swan, venison, or other noble foods could face harsh penalties, including mutilation or death. These dietary restrictions weren't just about luxury, they extended to basic nutrition, with laws limiting how much meat, white bread, and other quality foods peasants could consume. The absurdity of these laws extended to every aspect of daily life. Peasants could be punished for using certain types of soap, sleeping on certain types of bedding, or even walking in certain areas of towns and cities. The legal system was designed to keep people in their assigned social positions through the constant threat of punishment for any attempt at improvement or advancement. Poaching hunting animals on someone else's land was punishable by death, and this wasn't just talking about hunting royal deer in the king's forests. Even catching rabbits, birds, or fish on land that didn't belong to you could result in execution. The wealthy landowners had exclusive rights to all wildlife on their property, and they enforced these rights with deadly seriousness. The definition of poaching was so broad that it included almost any interaction with wildlife. Setting snares for rabbits, collecting eggs from wild birds, or even gathering nuts and berries could be considered poaching if done on someone else's land. Given that most peasants had no land of their own and lived surrounded by property belonging to nobles, it was almost impossible to supplement their meager diets without technically committing capital crimes. The enforcement of poaching laws was often corrupt and vindictive. Landowners could accuse peasants of poaching without evidence, and the accused had little recourse. Game wardens, who were often little more than armed thugs employed by wealthy landowners, could arrest, beat, or even kill suspected poachers with minimal legal consequences. Vagrancy was another serious crime that could result in death. If you couldn't prove you had a job or a permanent home, you could be arrested, whipped, branded, mutilated, or executed. The authorities were so paranoid about unemployed people that they created harsh laws to force everyone into some form of labor, no matter how degrading or poorly paid. The vagrancy laws were designed to prevent peasants from leaving their home villages in search of better opportunities. Anyone found traveling without proper documentation could be arrested as a vagrant. The documentation required was often expensive and difficult to obtain, making legal travel nearly impossible for poor people. These laws created a system where peasants were essentially trapped in their home communities, unable to seek better opportunities elsewhere without risking their lives. The penalty for vagrancy escalated with repeated offenses. First offense might result in whipping, second offense could involve branding or mutilation, and third offense was often punishable by death. Religious crimes were particularly severe, reflecting the enormous power of the Catholic Church in medieval society. Heresy, having religious beliefs that differed from official church doctrine, was punishable by being burned alive at the stake. But the definition of heresy was so broad that almost any deviation from orthodox belief could be fatal. Even minor religious infractions could result in severe punishment. Working on Sunday, eating meat during Lent, failing to attend church services, or expressing doubts about religious teachings could all be treated as crimes. The enforcement of religious laws was often used to settle personal disputes or eliminate inconvenient individuals. The process for determining heresy was stacked against the accused. The Inquisition, which operated in many parts of medieval Europe, used torture to extract confessions and operated under rules that made conviction almost inevitable. Accusers could remain anonymous, making it impossible for defendants to confront their accusers or challenge the evidence against them. Adultery, particularly by women, was a capital offense in many jurisdictions. A married woman caught with another man could be executed, while her male partner might receive a lesser punishment or escape entirely. The double standard was extreme and deadly, reflecting the medieval view of women as property belonging to their husbands. The enforcement of adultery laws was often based on rumor and suspicion rather than evidence. A woman could be executed based on nothing more than gossip or the testimony of a single witness. The legal system provided no protection for women falsely accused of adultery, and the social stigma was so severe that even acquittal could result in social death. Speaking ill of the king or nobles, even in private conversation, could be considered treason, which carried the death penalty. There were networks of informants who would report on their neighbors' conversations, creating an atmosphere of fear and suspicion that poisoned community relationships. The definition of treason was incredibly broad and could include almost any criticism of authority. Questioning a royal policy, expressing sympathy for the king's enemies, or even failing to show sufficient enthusiasm for royal proclamations could all be treated as treasonous acts. The punishment for treason was designed to be as horrific as possible, both to eliminate threats to royal authority and to terrify potential dissidents. The methods of determining guilt or innocence were medieval in the worst possible way. Trial by ordeal was based on the belief that God would intervene to protect the innocent, but the ordeals were designed in ways that made survival unlikely regardless of guilt or innocence. Trial by fire required the accused to carry a red-hot iron bar for a specified distance, usually 9 paces, or walk barefoot across burning coals. The burns were then bandaged and examined 3 days later. If the wounds appeared to be healing cleanly, the person was declared innocent. If infection had set in, which was almost inevitable given medieval understanding of wound care, they were declared guilty and executed. The absurdity of this system is obvious to modern minds, but medieval people genuinely believed that God would heal the wounds of innocent people while allowing the guilty to suffer infection. The reality was that almost everyone subjected to trial by fire would develop infections, making conviction and execution the most likely outcome. Trial by water came in 2 varieties, both potentially fatal. In cold water ordeal, the accused was bound hand and foot and thrown into a body of water, usually a river or pond. If they sank, they were considered innocent and usually drowned in the process of proving their innocence. If they floated, they were guilty of witchcraft and would be executed, often by burning. The logic behind this ordeal was that water, as a pure element blessed by God, would reject evil people and accept innocent ones. In practice, factors like body fat, lung capacity, and clothing could affect whether someone sank or floated, making the outcome essentially random. Either way, the accused person was likely to die. Hot water ordeal required the accused to reach into a pot of boiling water to retrieve a stone or ring. The depth varied depending on the severity of the accusation. Minor crimes required reaching to the wrist, while more serious charges required reaching to the elbow. Like trial by fire, the healing of the resulting burns was taken as a sign of innocence. The scalding injuries from hot water ordeal were often so severe that they caused permanent disability or death regardless of the legal outcome. Many people died from shock during the procedure itself, while others succumbed to infections that developed in the following days. Those who survived often lost the use of their hands or arms. Trial by combat allowed accused parties to fight their accuser or hire a champion to fight for them. The belief was that God would ensure victory for the righteous party. This system heavily favored those who could afford skilled fighters or who happened to be physically powerful themselves. Many innocent people died simply because they weren't skilled fighters or couldn't afford competent champions. The wealthy could essentially buy their way out of legal trouble by hiring professional fighters, while the poor faced almost certain death if challenged to combat. Women, the elderly, and disabled people were particularly vulnerable under the system. Even when trials moved beyond ordeal-based systems, the medieval legal process remained heavily biased against the poor and powerless. Witnesses could often be bought or intimidated. Evidence could be fabricated or destroyed. Judges were frequently corrupt and could be bribed by wealthy defendants who had the resources to influence legal proceedings. The concept of legal representation was virtually non-existent for common people. Lawyers were expensive and often more interested in collecting fees than in defending their clients effectively. Most people facing legal charges had to represent themselves against trained legal professionals who had every advantage in terms of knowledge, resources, and social connections. The punishments for crimes were designed to be as public and humiliating as possible, serving as warnings to others who might consider breaking the law. Public execution was common entertainment, with entire communities gathering to watch criminals die in various horrible ways. These events were often treated as festivals, with vendors selling food and drink to the crowds. Hanging was the most common form of execution, but medieval executioners often lacked the knowledge or equipment to perform it quickly and humanely. Without proper technique and appropriate rope, victims could strangle slowly for minutes rather than dying quickly from a broken neck. Some executions were deliberately botched to increase the victim's suffering and the crowd's entertainment. Drawing and quartering was reserved for the most serious crimes, particularly treason. The victim would first be dragged through the streets behind a horse, suffering injuries from the rough ground and debris. They would then be hanged until nearly dead, cut down while still alive, and disemboweled. Finally, they would be cut into quarters, with different body parts displayed in various locations as warnings to others. This process was designed to maximize both physical suffering and psychological terror. The public nature of the punishment, combined with the extended torture involved, was meant to demonstrate the absolute power of authority and the futility of resistance. The remains would be left on display for weeks or months, serving as constant reminders of the consequences of challenging the established order. Burning at the stake was used primarily for heretics, witches, and other crimes that were considered spiritually polluting. The process could be relatively quick if the victim died of smoke inhalation, but it could also be prolonged and agonizing if the fire was built to burn slowly or if wind patterns prevented smoke from reaching the victim quickly. Professional executioners developed techniques for controlling the speed of burning, sometimes accepting bribes from victims' families to ensure a quicker death, or being paid extra by authorities who wanted to maximize suffering. The type of wood used, the arrangement of the fuel, and even the weather conditions could dramatically affect how long the victim survived. For lesser crimes, punishments included public whipping, time in the stocks of a pillory, branding with hot irons, and various forms of mutilation. These penalties were designed to mark criminals permanently, making it impossible for them to escape their past or integrate into new communities. The stocks and pillory were designed to subject criminals to public humiliation while they were physically restrained. The devices held victims in uncomfortable positions for hours or days, during which time community members were encouraged to abuse them. People would throw rotten food, animal waste, stones, and other objects at the helpless victims. Many people died from injuries sustained during their time in these devices. Heavy objects thrown by angry crowds could cause serious head injuries. Exposure to weather, combined with the inability to move or seek shelter, led to death from hypothermia or heat stroke. Some victims were literally pelted to death by crowds who got carried away in their abuse. Branding with hot irons marked criminals permanently, usually on the face or forehead where the marks couldn't be hidden. Different crimes received different brands. Thieves might be branded with a T, adulterers with an A, and so on. These marks made it impossible for criminals to start fresh in new communities, as their past crimes were literally written on their faces. The branding process itself was dangerous and often led to serious infections or death from shock. The irons were heated in open fires and applied by executioners who had no medical training. Many people died from the branding procedure itself, while others suffered permanent disfigurement that went far beyond the intended mark. Mutilation was another common punishment that left criminals permanently disabled. Thieves might have their hands cut off, liars might have their tongues removed, and those who committed crimes involving sight might be blinded. These punishments were performed without anesthesia or proper surgical technique, leading to high rates of death from shock, blood loss, and infection. The social and economic consequences of mutilation were severe. People who lost hands couldn't work in most occupations, forcing them to become beggars or depend on charity. Those who lost their tongues couldn't communicate effectively, making it difficult to work or maintain relationships. Blinded criminals faced a lifetime of dependency and poverty. Fines were also common punishments, but they were often set so high that poor people couldn't pay them, resulting in more severe physical punishments as alternatives. The wealthy could literally buy their way out of most legal troubles, while the poor faced harsh physical consequences for the same crimes. This created a two-tier justice system where punishment was determined more by wealth than by guilt or innocence. The inability to pay fines often led to imprisonment, but medieval prisons were private enterprises where inmates had to pay for their own food, bedding, and basic necessities. Those who couldn't afford these fees would literally starve to death in their cells, creating a system where poverty was effectively a capital crime. Debtors' prisons held people who owed money, but since they couldn't work while imprisoned, they had no way to pay off their debts. The debts would continue to grow due to interest charges and prison fees, making it impossible for most debtors ever to gain their freedom. Many people spent their entire lives in prison for relatively small debts that snowballed into insurmountable obligations. Women faced additional legal restrictions and punishments that reflected their second-class status in medieval society. In many places, women couldn't own property, enter contracts, or testify in court. They were legally considered property of their fathers or husbands, with no independent legal existence. The legal disabilities of women made them particularly vulnerable to abuse and exploitation. They couldn't seek legal redress for wrongs committed against them, and they had no recourse when men used the legal system to harm them. Many laws were specifically designed to control women's behavior and keep them subordinate to male authority. A woman accused of being a witch faced almost certain execution, as the evidence required to prove innocence was essentially impossible to provide. The witch trial process was designed to extract confessions through torture, and the legal procedures were stacked against the accused. Older women, widows, and women who didn't conform to social expectations were particularly vulnerable to these accusations. The scold's bridle was a metal cage placed over a woman's head as punishment for nagging, gossiping, or speaking out against her husband or other male authority figures. The device had a metal plate that pressed down on the tongue, making it impossible to speak. Women could be forced to wear these devices for hours, days, or even longer periods. The physical trauma of wearing a scold's bridle was severe. The metal parts could cut the mouth and tongue, causing infections and permanent damage. The inability to eat, drink, or speak properly could lead to malnutrition and dehydration. Some women died from complications related to wearing these devices. Ducking stools were used to punish women accused of various social crimes like scolding, gossip, or adultery. The woman would be strapped to a chair attached to a lever and repeatedly dunked into cold water, sometimes for hours at a time. Many women died from drowning, hypothermia, or shock during this punishment. The psychological trauma of ducking was as severe as the physical dangers. The experience of being repeatedly submerged while helpless and restrained was designed to break the victim's spirit and serve as a warning to other women who might challenge male authority. Even those who survived often suffered long-term psychological damage. Children were subject to the same harsh punishments as adults for many crimes. There was no separate juvenile justice system, and children as young as 7 could be executed for theft or other crimes. The concept of childhood as a protected stage of development didn't exist in medieval legal thinking. Child criminals faced the same brutal punishments as adults, including hanging, mutilation, and branding. A 7-year-old caught stealing food could be executed alongside adult thieves. The legal system made no allowance for children's limited understanding, developmental issues, or the circumstances that might drive them to crime. Treatment of child criminals reflected medieval attitudes toward children in general. They were seen as miniature adults who were fully responsible for their actions. The high infant mortality rate meant that society didn't invest much emotional energy in protecting children, and legal systems reflected this harsh pragmatism. Appeals processes were limited or non-existent in most medieval legal systems. Once a sentence was pronounced, it was usually carried out immediately. There was no time for reflection, investigation of new evidence, or consideration of mitigating circumstances. The finality of medieval justice meant that mistakes could never be corrected. The lack of appeals also meant that corrupt or incompetent judges could operate with impunity. Local magistrates and officials could pursue personal vendettas, settle old scores, or eliminate inconvenient individuals without fear that their decisions would be reviewed by higher authorities. Record keeping was put in most medieval jurisdictions, so many legal proceedings went undocumented. This meant that legal precedents were inconsistent, and similar crimes might receive vastly different punishments depending on local customs, the judge's mood, or political considerations. Justice was highly personal and subjective. The poor record keeping also made it difficult to track repeat offenders or to ensure that sentences were carried out properly. Some criminals might escape punishment entirely due to administrative incompetence, while others might be punished multiple times for the same crime due to bureaucratic confusion. Corruption was endemic at every level of the medieval legal system. Judges could be bribed, witnesses could be bought, and evidence could be fabricated or destroyed. The wealthy had numerous ways to influence legal proceedings, while the poor had no protection from false accusations or malicious prosecution. The corruption extended beyond simple bribery to include complex networks of patronage and obligation that determined legal outcomes. A person's social connections were often more important than the facts of their case. Those who lacked powerful protectors were vulnerable to anyone who wanted to harm them through the legal system. The medieval legal system was designed to maintain social order through fear rather than justice. The harsh punishments and public spectacles of execution were intended to terrorize people into compliance with social norms and respect for authority. The system succeeded in maintaining order, but at the cost of justice, mercy, and human dignity. For the average person living in medieval times, the legal system was not a source of protection but a constant threat. Any minor infraction, any social misstep, any accusation by a more powerful person could result in torture, mutilation, or death. Justice was not blind, it was corrupt, arbitrary, and deadly. The medieval legal legacy reminds us why concepts like due process, presumption of innocence, and equal protection under law are so important. These principles, which we often take for granted, were developed in response to the horrors of medieval justice. The legal systems we enjoy today exist because people recognized that the medieval approach to law and punishment was fundamentally inhumane and unjust. Chapter 5: The social hierarchy you place in the human pecking order. Medieval society wasn't just unfair, it was systematically designed to crush the hopes, dreams, and lives of the vast majority of people while concentrating all power, wealth, and opportunity in the hands of a tiny elite. If you were born a peasant, you would die a peasant, and your children and grandchildren would suffer the same fate for generations to come. The feudal system was essentially a pyramid of oppression with the king at the top, followed by nobles, knights, clergy, and at the bottom where 85–90% of the population lived the peasants, serfs, and villeins who did all the actual work while receiving almost none of the benefits. Let's start at the bottom, where you would almost certainly find yourself. As a serf, not quite a slave, but the distinction was meaningless. In practical terms, you were legally bound to the land where you were born. This meant you could never leave without your lord's permission that was rarely granted and usually came with conditions that made freedom impossible to achieve. The legal status of serfdom was complex and deliberately confusing, designed to trap people in a system they couldn't escape or fully understand. You weren't technically owned like chattel slaves, but you were bound to specific pieces of land and could be bought and sold along with that land. If your lord sold his estate, you became the property of the new owner, regardless of your wishes or family situation. You didn't own the land you worked, the house you lived in, or even the tools you used for farming. Everything belonged to your lord, including the right to control where you lived, what work you did, whom you could marry, and even where you could go to church. Your lord owned you in every way that mattered, and the legal fiction of not being a slave provided no practical protection or freedom. The work expected of you was backbreaking and never-ending. You owed your lord a certain number of days of labor each week, typically 3 days out of 7, but this could increase to 6 or 7 days during busy periods like planting and harvest. These weren't regular 8-hour workdays, either. You worked from dawn to dusk, often 12 to 16 hours a day during busy seasons. But your labor obligation wasn't your only duty to your lord. During harvest time, planting season, hay cutting, and other critical periods, you might be required to work your lord's land every day, leaving no time to tend your own small plot. Your family would go hungry while you worked to fill your lord's granaries with crops you would never eat. The small plot of land you were allowed to cultivate for your own family's survival was usually the worst land on the estate, rocky, poorly drained, steep, or otherwise unsuitable for good crops. This wasn't accidental. Your lord kept the best land for his own use and gave you whatever was left over. You were expected to feed your family from soil that could barely grow weeds. Even on this marginal land, you didn't have complete control. Your lord could dictate what crops you grew, when you planted and harvested them, and how you used the land. If he needed the land for other purposes, pasturing his animals, hunting, or expanding his own cultivation, he could evict you without compensation or alternative housing. The taxes and obligations you owed were crushing and seemingly endless. In addition to your labor, you owed a portion of everything you produced. If you grew grain, you owed some to your lord, often as much as half your harvest. If you raised chickens, you owed eggs and meat. If you had a cow, you owed milk and cheese. These weren't small percentages, but major portions of your production that left your family with barely enough to survive. The church demanded its share too, in the form of tithes, another 10% of your production that went to support the local clergy. Then there were special taxes for holidays, weddings, funerals, and any other occasion the authorities could think of. By the time you paid all your obligations, you were left with maybe 30–40% of what you produced if you were lucky. These obligations were calculated in the most disadvantageous way possible for the peasants. You owed the best portion of your crops, the largest eggs, the fattest chickens, the finest grain. What remained for your family was often the inferior portion that your lord and the church didn't want. This system ensured that those who did the work ate the worst food, while those who didn't work ate the best. Marriage required your lord's permission, and he could refuse for any reason or no reason at all. He might demand payment for permission to marry, or require extra years of labor from you or your prospective spouse. Some lords used marriage permissions as rewards for favored serfs or punishments for those who displeased them. If you wanted to marry someone from another estate, the complications multiplied. Your lord might demand compensation for losing your labor, or the other lord might refuse to accept a new serf from outside his domain. Many couples were forced to live apart because they couldn't get permission to marry, while others were forced into unwanted marriages that served their lord's interests rather than their own. Your children belonged to your lord as much as they belonged to you. They were bound to the same land and the same servitude from the moment they were born. If your lord decided he needed more workers elsewhere, he could separate families by moving some members to different properties. Parents had no legal right to keep their families together if their lord decided otherwise. The lord's control over your children extended to decisions about their future at work, marriage, and even survival. During times of food shortage, he might decide which children would receive rations and which would be left to starve. He could take your children away to work in his household, to be trained in specific trades that served his interests, or to be given as gifts to other lords. Education was forbidden to serfs in many places and actively discouraged everywhere. Learning to read and write was considered above your station and potentially dangerous to the social order. Your lord had no interest in educated serfs who might question their conditions or seek to improve the circumstances. Ignorance was a tool of control that kept serfs trapped in their circumstances. The few serfs who somehow learned to read and write faced suspicion and hostility from both their lords and their fellow peasants. Literacy made you dangerous to the established order and also set you apart from your community in ways that could be socially isolating. Knowledge was power, and power was not meant for people of your social class. Legal rights for serfs were minimal or non-existent. Your lord could punish you for infractions, both real and imagined, and there was little recourse to higher authorities. He could fine you, imprison you, beat you, or even kill you with minimal legal consequences. The legal system was designed to protect lords' property rights, and you were property. You couldn't testify against your lord in court, and your word carried no weight against that of any free person. This meant you had no legal protection from abuse, fraud, or violence committed by anyone of higher social status. Justice was not available to people like you. The legal system existed to protect those who oppressed you. The housing provided for serfs was barely adequate for survival and designed to remind you of your lowly status. Your lord had no incentive to provide comfortable accommodations. He just needed you healthy enough to work. Repairs to your hovel were your responsibility, using your own time and resources even though you didn't own the building. The location of serf housing was also deliberately degrading. Serfs' homes were usually built in the worst locations on the estate areas prone to flooding, far from water sources, or downwind from animal pens and waste disposal areas. The message was clear: you were less important than livestock and deserved worse living conditions. If you became sick or injured and couldn't work, you received no compensation or support from your lord. You might be thrown off the land entirely if you became a burden that couldn't contribute to the estate's productivity. Old age offered no security. You worked until you died or became so incapacitated that you were no longer useful. The concept of retirement didn't exist for serfs. You were expected to work until your body gave out, and when it did, you became dependent on your family or community charity. Many elderly serfs died of starvation or exposure because they could no longer earn their keep and had no savings or pension to support them. Moving up in the social hierarchy was virtually impossible. Even becoming a free peasant, the lowest level of non-serf, required your lord's permission, and usually a substantial payment that most serfs could never afford. The few serfs who managed to buy their freedom often had to indebt themselves so heavily that they ended up worse off than before. Some lords would promise freedom in exchange for years of extra labor, but these agreements were often broken or modified to make freedom impossible to achieve. A serf might work extra years without pay, only to have his lord decide that the agreement was invalid or that additional conditions needed to be met. The legal system provided no protection for serfs against such fraud. The system was designed to be self-perpetuating and nearly impossible to escape. Even if a serf somehow managed to accumulate enough wealth to buy his freedom, the lord could simply raise the price, claim the money was insufficient, or find legal pretexts to avoid the transaction. The few serfs who did achieve freedom often found that their children were still considered bound to the land, trapping the next generation in the same servitude. The psychological impact of this system was devastating. Serfs lived with the constant knowledge that they had no control over their own lives, no hope for improvement, and no way to protect themselves or their families from the whims of their social superiors. This learned helplessness was deliberately cultivated by the system to prevent rebellion and maintain social order. Children born into serfdom learned from infancy that they were inferior beings destined for lives of servitude. They were taught to be submissive, obedient, and grateful for whatever scraps of kindness their betters might show them. This psychological conditioning was so complete that many serfs genuinely believed they deserved their fate and that attempting to improve their condition would be morally wrong. But let's say you were lucky enough to be born a free peasant rather than a serf. Your life was still brutal and constrained, just slightly less hopeless. You could own small amounts of property, move from place to place within limits, and choose your own occupation from the narrow range of options available to people of your class. Free peasants faced constant pressure from above and competition from below. Local lords could impose new taxes, change laws, or seize property with little recourse. The king could demand military service at any time, forcing you to leave your farm and family to fight in wars that had nothing to do with your interests or welfare. The military service obligations for free peasants were particularly onerous. When called to war, you had to provide your own weapons, armor, and supplies for campaigns that could last months or years. Many peasant families were bankrupted by these military obligations, forced to sell their land and possessions to equip their men for war. The mortality rate for peasant soldiers was astronomical. They were used as cannon fodder in battles planned by noble commanders who had no regard for their lives. Those who survived often returned home wounded, disabled, or traumatized, unable to work their farms effectively. Many families were destroyed by military service that took away their primary breadwinners permanently. Competition for land and resources among peasants was fierce and often destructive. Without modern agricultural techniques, there was only so much arable land available, and population pressure meant that many families didn't have enough land to support themselves adequately. This created a desperate scramble for resources that pitted neighbor against neighbor. The guild system controlled most trades and crafts in medieval towns, creating another layer of oppression for anyone who wanted to improve their economic situation. If you wanted to become a blacksmith, baker, carpenter, or practice any other skilled trade, you had to gain admission to the appropriate guild through a process designed to limit competition and maintain official scarcity. Becoming a guild member required years of unpaid apprenticeship, during which you worked for a master craftsman who provided minimal food and shelter in exchange for your labor. The apprenticeship period could last 7 years or more, during which you had no income, no freedom to change masters, and no guarantee that you would ever be accepted as a full guild member. After completing your apprenticeship, you had to work as a journeyman for several more years, traveling from town to town to gain experience with different masters. This period was also poorly paid and unstable, as journeymen had no job security and could be dismissed at any time. The constant travel made it impossible to establish a family or put down roots anywhere. Even if you completed the apprenticeship and journeyman periods successfully, becoming a master craftsman required substantial fees, the approval of existing guild members, and often a masterpiece that demonstrated your skills. The existing masters had every incentive to limit the number of new masters to reduce competition, so many qualified journeymen were never admitted to full membership. Guild rules were extremely restrictive and designed to prevent innovation or economic advancement. Masters could only produce certain types of goods, charge fixed prices, and employ limited numbers of workers. Any attempt to improve products, reduce costs, or expand operations could result in fines, expulsion from the guild, or other punishments that destroyed your livelihood. The guild system also perpetuated social inequality by making it nearly impossible for poor people to enter skilled trades. The long unpaid apprenticeship period was feasible only for families wealthy enough to support a child who produced no income for 7 years. Poor families couldn't afford to lose their children's labor for such extended periods, trapping them in unskilled occupations. Women faced additional restrictions at every level of society that made economic advancement even more difficult. A peasant woman had fewer legal rights than a peasant man, couldn't inherit property in her own name in most places, and was legally subordinate to her father, husband, or nearest male relative throughout her life. The economic opportunities available to women were severely limited and generally poorly paid. Women could work in textile production, food preparation, domestic service, or a few other traditionally female occupations, but they were excluded from most skilled trades and leadership positions. Even in fields dominated by women, the most profitable positions were usually controlled by men. Marriage was often an economic necessity for women rather than a choice, as they had few other options for survival. But marriage also meant giving up what little economic independence they might have had, as married women couldn't own property, enter contracts, or control their own earnings. Everything a woman produced or earned belonged to her husband. The legal and social restrictions on women created a cycle of dependence that was difficult to break. Women needed male protection to survive, but accepting that protection meant giving up their autonomy and economic freedom. Those who tried to remain independent faced social ostracism, economic hardship, and sometimes accusations of witchcraft or immoral behavior. Noble women, despite their wealth and social status, faced many of the same restrictions as peasant women, just in more luxurious surroundings. They couldn't inherit property directly in most places, were married off to form political alliances, and had their primary value measured by their ability to produce male heirs for their husbands' families. The lives of noble women were certainly more comfortable than those of peasant women, but they were equally lacking in personal freedom and self-determination. A noble woman might live in a castle rather than a hovel, but she was still essentially property to be bought, sold, and traded according to the political and economic interests of the men who controlled her life. The church offered some opportunities for women through religious life, but even convents were dominated by male authority. Nuns took vows of obedience not just to God but to the male church hierarchy, and abbesses answered to bishops and other male religious authorities. The church provided some education and relative independence for women, but within strictly defined limits that reinforced rather than challenged gender hierarchies. The clergy occupied a unique position in medieval social hierarchy, wielding enormous power and influence while theoretically being servants of God and the church. In practice, high-ranking church officials lived like nobles, accumulating vast wealth and political power, while the lower clergy often lived in conditions barely better than the peasants they served. The church owned approximately 1/3 of all land in medieval Europe, making it one of the largest landowners and economic powers. This wealth was used to build magnificent cathedrals and monasteries, support lavish lifestyles for church leaders, and fund political activities that had little to do with spiritual concerns. The corruption of the medieval church was systematic and pervasive. Church positions were bought and sold like commodities, with wealthy families purchasing high-ranking positions for their younger sons. Many bishops and abbots were more interested in political power and economic gain than in spiritual leadership or serving their congregations. The practice of simony buying and selling church positions was technically forbidden but universally practiced. Wealthy families would pay enormous sums to secure church appointments that came with guaranteed income, political influence, and social status. These purchased positions were often held by people who had no genuine religious calling or qualifications for spiritual leadership. Clerical celibacy was another rule that was widely ignored by medieval clergy. Many priests, bishops, and even popes had wives, concubines, and children despite their vows of celibacy. Some church leaders openly maintained families and used church resources to support their relatives and advance their dynasties. The taxation system imposed by the church was another burden on an already oppressed population. The tithe, which required everyone to give 10% of their income to the church, was rigorously enforced and often collected in the most brutal ways possible. Church tax collectors would seize property, livestock, and crops from people who couldn't pay, leaving families destitute. The church also imposed numerous additional taxes and fees for religious services that should have been provided freely. Baptisms, marriages, funerals, and other sacraments required payments that many poor families couldn't afford. People died without last rites, were buried in unconsecrated ground, or had their marriages declared invalid because they couldn't pay the required fees. The nobility lived in a different world entirely from the peasants who supported them, but their lives were also constrained by the rigid social hierarchy and expectations of their class. Noble children were raised from birth to believe in their inherent superiority and right to rule over others, but they were also trapped in roles that offered little personal freedom or self-determination. Noble marriages were arranged for political and economic advantage, with little regard for the feelings or preferences of the parties involved. Children might be betrothed in infancy to people they had never met, with their entire futures determined by considerations of territorial expansion, military alliances, or dynastic succession. The education provided to noble children focused on military skills for boys and household management for girls, with little attention to intellectual development or personal interests. Boys learned to fight, hunt, and command others, while girls learned to manage servants, oversee domestic production, and serve their husbands' interests. The constant warfare that characterized medieval life meant that noble families lived with the ongoing threat of violence, death, and financial ruin. Wars could destroy years of careful political maneuvering and economic development in a matter of months. Defeat in battle could mean death, exile, or the loss of all property and status. The competition among noble families was intense and often deadly. Rivals would use any means necessary to advance their own interests and destroy their enemies, including assassination, false accusations, military attacks, and complex political conspiracies. Trust was rare and dangerous in a world where today's ally could become tomorrow's mortal enemy. The economic obligations of nobility were also significant, though obviously much less burdensome than those faced by peasants. Nobles were expected to maintain expensive lifestyles, support large households, provide military service to their overlords, and fund various charitable and religious activities. Those who couldn't meet these expectations faced social ostracism and political marginalization. The concept of noblesse oblige, the idea that privilege comes with responsibility, was honored more in theory than in practice. While nobles were supposed to protect and care for their subjects, most were more interested in extracting as much wealth as possible from their lands and people. The welfare of peasants was a secondary consideration at best. Kings, at the top of the social hierarchy, faced their own unique challenges and constraints despite their enormous power. Medieval kingship was a dangerous occupation with a high mortality rate, as rulers faced constant threats from foreign enemies, domestic rivals, and their own subjects. Many kings died violent deaths in battle from assassination or from poison administered by rivals. The political system that supported medieval monarchy was inherently unstable, based more on personal relationships and military force than on institutional structures or legal frameworks. A king's power depended on his ability to maintain the loyalty of his nobles through a combination of rewards, threats, and personal charisma. Weakness or failure could quickly lead to rebellion and overthrow. Royal succession was often disputed and violent, with multiple claimants fighting civil wars that devastated entire kingdoms. The lack of clear succession laws meant that royal deaths frequently triggered periods of chaos and conflict that could last for years or decades. These succession crises caused enormous suffering for ordinary people who were caught in the crossfire. The cost of maintaining royal power was enormous, requiring constant taxation of an already impoverished population. Kings needed funds for military campaigns, court expenses, diplomatic activities, and the bribes and rewards necessary to maintain noble loyalty. The burden of supporting royal government fell disproportionately on those least able to afford it. Medieval social mobility was not just limited, it was actively discouraged and punished by authorities who recognized that allowing people to improve their circumstances would threaten the stability of the entire system. The few cases of successful social advancement were often used as propaganda to suggest that the system was fair, while ignoring the vast majority of people who remained trapped in their birth circumstances. The psychological and cultural mechanisms that maintained social hierarchy were as important as the legal and economic structures. People were taught from birth that social inequality was natural, divinely ordained, and morally correct. Those at the bottom were told they deserved their fate due to their inherent inferiority or the sins of their ancestors. Religious doctrine was used to justify and reinforce social inequality at every level. The Church taught that God had established the social order and that challenging it was not just rebellion against earthly authority but sin against divine will. Suffering in this life was presented as preparation for rewards in the afterlife, encouraging acceptance of injustice rather than resistance to it. The medieval social hierarchy was a system of systematic oppression that successfully maintained extreme inequality for centuries through a combination of violence, propaganda, and structural constraints that made escape nearly impossible. For the vast majority of medieval people, social class was not just a description of their current circumstances, but a prison that confined them from birth to death, trapping not only them but their children and grandchildren in lives of deprivation and subjugation. Chapter 6: Women's Lives when half the population had no rights. If you thought being a peasant man in medieval times was hard, try being a woman. Medieval society treated women not as human beings with rights and dignity, but as property to be owned, controlled, and disposed of according to the wishes of the men who had power over them. From birth to death, a medieval woman's life was defined by subjugation, danger, and systematic oppression that would be unthinkable in modern society. Let's start with birth, assuming you survived it. Female infanticide wasn't officially sanctioned in medieval Europe, but it happened frequently enough that demographic records show suspiciously high infant mortality rates among girls compared to boys. Families with limited resources often saw daughters as burdens rather than assets, since girls couldn't inherit property, carry on the family name, or provide the same economic value as sons. If you survived infancy as a girl, your childhood was drastically different from that of your brothers. While boys might have opportunities for education, training in trades, or advancement through military service or religious careers, girls were prepared for only one role: wife and mother. You would spend your childhood learning domestic skills like spinning, weaving, cooking, and childcare, not because these were particularly valued skills, but because they were all society would allow you to do. The disparity in treatment between boys and girls was evident from the earliest age. Boys received better food, clothing, and medical care because families invested more resources in children who could potentially advance the family's status or provide economic returns. Girls were fed less, given inferior clothing, and received minimal medical attention because their future value was seen as limited. Education for girls was almost non-existent outside of the very highest social classes, and even then it was severely restricted. Literacy was considered unnecessary or even dangerous for women, as educated women might question their subordinate status or develop ideas above their station. The few women who learnt to read and write usually did so in convents, but even religious education for women focused more on obedience and domesticity than on intellectual development. Marriage wasn't something that happened to you as a medieval woman, it was something that was done to you by the men who controlled your life. Medieval marriages were business transactions arranged by fathers to benefit their families economically, politically, or socially. Your wishes, feelings, and preferences were not just irrelevant, they were actively discouraged as inappropriate and potentially disruptive to family interests. The age of marriage for girls was shockingly young by modern standards, reflecting their status as property to be transferred from father to husband. While canon law theoretically set the minimum age at 12, Many girls were betrothed or married even younger, with a marriage to be consummated when they reached puberty. Your father could legally promise you in marriage before you could walk or talk, and you would have no legal right to refuse the arrangement. The betrothal process often began in early childhood, with families negotiating detailed contracts that specified not just the marriage terms, but also the transfer of property, political alliances, and economic arrangements that would benefit both families. You, as a bride, were essentially a commodity being traded to cement these agreements, with no more say in the matter than a piece of livestock being sold at market. The wedding ceremony itself was often the first time you would meet your husband, particularly in arranged marriages between wealthy families where political considerations outweighed personal compatibility. Many brides went to their wedding beds as virtual strangers to the men who would control every aspect of their lives from that moment forward. Once married, you legally ceased to exist as an independent person under the doctrine of coverture. This legal principle held that a married woman's legal identity was completely absorbed by her husband's, meaning you couldn't own property, sign contracts, sue in court, or make any legal decisions without your husband's permission. Everything you had brought to the marriage became his property, and everything you earned or inherited thereafter also belonged to him. The loss of legal identity extended to every aspect of your existence. You couldn't enter into business agreements, borrow money, or even make purchases beyond basic household necessities without your husband's explicit approval. If you had been a successful businesswoman before marriage, you would lose all control over your enterprises, which would be managed by your husband according to his interests rather than yours. Your primary value as a married woman was your ability to produce male heirs who could inherit your husband's property and carry on his family line. This reduced you to essentially a breeding machine whose worth was measured by your fertility and your success in producing sons. Failure to become pregnant, repeated miscarriages, or producing only daughters could lead to divorce, abandonment, or worse. Pregnancy in medieval times was dangerous and frequent. Without reliable birth control methods, married women were pregnant almost continuously throughout their childbearing years, facing the risks of death or serious injury with each pregnancy. Maternal mortality rates were astronomical, with estimates suggesting that 10–20% of all women died in childbirth, making pregnancy potentially as dangerous as going to war. The lack of medical knowledge about women's bodies made pregnancy and childbirth even more dangerous than they needed to be. Physicians had little understanding of female anatomy, often viewing women as inferior versions of men rather than as beings with their own distinct physiological characteristics. Medical texts contained wildly inaccurate information about women's bodies and reproductive processes. Childbirth itself was a nightmare of pain, danger, and superstition. Labor could last for days without medical intervention, and complications that are easily treatable today were automatic death sentences. Breech presentations, prolonged labor, postpartum hemorrhaging, and infections all frequently resulted in the death of both mother and child. The midwives who attended births were often well-intentioned but poorly trained, working with techniques based more on tradition and superstition than on medical knowledge. Some midwifery practices actually increased the dangers of childbirth, such as refusing to wash hands, using contaminated instruments, or attempting to speed labor through violent manipulation of the baby or mother. If you survived childbirth, you faced the constant heartbreak of infant mortality. Roughly half of all children died before their 5th birthday, and as a mother, you would likely bury several of your babies during your lifetime. The emotional trauma of repeated infant loss was something medieval women simply had to endure, as there was no understanding of grief counseling or mental health support. The high rate of infant mortality created a psychological defense mechanism among medieval women who learned not to become too emotionally attached to young children who were likely to die. This emotional distance may have been protective, but it also meant the natural bonding between mothers and children was often suppressed or delayed until children reached an age where survival seemed more likely. Between pregnancies, miscarriages, stillbirths, and infant deaths, a medieval woman's life was defined by a cycle of pregnancy, loss, and grief that never ended. You might become pregnant 10–15 times during your reproductive years and consider yourself fortunate if 3–5 children survived to adulthood. Each pregnancy brought the risk of death, and each birth was followed by the anxiety of wondering whether this child would live to see their 1st birthday. Domestic violence was not just tolerated in medieval society, but legally sanctioned and socially expected. Your husband had the legal right to discipline you physically, and the law provided specific guidelines for acceptable levels of violence. Various legal codes specify the types of weapons that could be used to beat wives, the circumstances that justified violence, and the extent of injury that was considered appropriate. The famous rule of thumb may or may not have existed as a specific legal doctrine, but the principle it represented was very real. Men were legally entitled to use physical violence to control their wives, and society supported and encouraged this practice. Wife beating was not seen as abuse but as necessary household management, comparable to disciplining children or training animals. The legal system provided no protection for women from domestic violence, as wives were considered property of their husbands who could treat that property as they saw fit. Even extreme violence that resulted in permanent injury or disfigurement was rarely prosecuted, and when it was, the penalties were minimal. A husband who killed his wife might face legal consequences, but one who merely beat her regularly faced no official sanctions. Economic dependence made escape from abusive marriages impossible for most women. Since you couldn't own property, earn independent income, or support yourself legally, leaving an abusive husband meant facing starvation, homelessness, and social ostracism. Even if you had family willing to take you in, doing so would create legal complications and financial burdens that most families were unwilling to accept. The social stigma attached to women who left their husbands was severe and lasting. A woman who abandoned her marriage was seen as morally corrupt, unreliable, and dangerous to social order. Such women had difficulty finding employment, housing, or social acceptance, and they were often suspected of prostitution or other immoral behavior regardless of their actual circumstances. Divorce was virtually impossible for women under medieval law and religious doctrine. While men could sometimes obtain annulments for various reasons, including political convenience, failure to produce male heirs, or simply wanting to marry someone else, women had almost no grounds for ending a marriage. Even in cases of extreme physical abuse, adultery by the husband, or complete abandonment, you were expected to remain faithful to your marriage vows. The religious doctrine that marriage was a sacrament instituted by God made divorce not just legally difficult, but spiritually problematic. The Catholic Church taught that marriage bonds could not be dissolved except in very limited circumstances, and these exceptions were rarely applied in ways that benefited women. A woman seeking to end her marriage was seen as challenging not just her husband's authority, but God's will. If your husband died, your situation often became even more precarious rather than improving. As a widow, you might have some legal rights to your husband's property, but these were frequently contested by his male relatives who saw you as an obstacle to their inheritance. Many widows were left destitute when their husbands' families successfully challenged their claims to dower rights or inheritance. The legal concept of dower theoretically protected widows by guaranteeing them a portion of their husband's estate, usually 1/3 of his property. However, this protection was often more theoretical than practical, as male relatives could use various legal strategies to minimize or eliminate widows' portions. The cost and complexity of legal proceedings made it difficult for widows to enforce their rights. Remarriage was often the only option for widows who wanted to avoid poverty, but it brought its own risks and complications. A second husband had no legal obligation to support children from your first marriage, and many stepfathers were hostile or abusive toward their predecessors' children. Remarriage also meant giving up whatever independence you might have gained as a widow and submitting once again to male authority. The pressure on widows to remarry quickly was intense, both from economic necessity and social expectation. A woman without a husband was seen as unnatural and potentially dangerous, requiring male supervision and control. Widows who chose to remain unmarried faced suspicion, harassment, and accusations of improper behavior, particularly if they were young or attractive. Women's sexuality was heavily controlled and policed by both legal and social mechanisms designed to ensure that men could be confident of their paternity and inheritance rights. Female chastity was seen as essential to social order, and any deviation from strict sexual norms could result in severe punishment or death. Adultery by a woman was a capital offense in many jurisdictions, while male adultery was often overlooked or treated as a minor infraction. This double standard reflected the medieval view that women's bodies belonged to their husbands, and that sexual infidelity by a wife was equivalent to theft of her husband's property. A woman could be executed for adultery based on nothing more than rumor or the testimony of a single witness. The concept of rape within marriage didn't exist in medieval law or culture. A husband had absolute and unlimited sexual rights to his wife's body, and she had no legal right to refuse his advances. Marital rape was not just legal but expected, and a wife who consistently refused her husband's sexual demands could be legally punished for failing in her marital duties. Prostitution occupied a complex and contradictory position in medieval society. While morally condemned by religious authorities, it was tacitly accepted by secular authorities as a necessary evil that protected respectable women from male sexual aggression. However, the women who worked as prostitutes faced brutal lives of exploitation, disease, violence, and early death. Prostitutes had no legal protections and were frequent victims of violence from clients, pimps, and law enforcement officials. They could be beaten, robbed, or killed with minimal legal consequences, as their low social status made their lives essentially worthless in the eyes of the law. Many prostitutes died young from sexually transmitted diseases, violence, or the dangerous conditions in which they were forced to work. The regulation of prostitution varied by location, but it was generally designed to contain and control rather than protect the women involved. Some cities established official red light districts where prostitution was tolerated, but these areas were often walled or segregated to prevent contamination of respectable neighborhoods. Prostitutes might be required to wear distinctive clothing or badges that marked them as social outcasts. Women accused of witchcraft faced almost certain death, as the legal procedures for determining guilt were designed to make conviction inevitable. The requirements for proving innocence were essentially impossible to meet, and the use of torture to extract confessions meant that most accused women would eventually admit to whatever charges were brought against them. The witch-hunting craze that periodically swept through medieval Europe was fundamentally about controlling women who didn't conform to social expectations. Older women, widows, women who were too independent, too knowledgeable about herbal medicine, too outspoken, or simply too successful economically could find themselves accused of consorting with the devil. The accusations often stemmed from personal disputes, property conflicts, or simple misogyny rather than any genuine belief in supernatural powers. A woman who inherited valuable property might find herself accused of witchcraft by male relatives who wanted to claim her inheritance. A skilled healer whose treatments were successful might be accused of using demonic magic rather than natural remedies. The torture methods used to extract confessions from accused witches were specifically designed to target women's bodies in sexually humiliating and physically devastating ways. Sleep deprivation, sexual assault, and various forms of physical torture were combined with psychological manipulation to break down resistance and force admissions of guilt. The witch trial process also included procedures like searching for devil's marks on the accused woman's body, which involved intimate physical examination and often torture disguised as medical investigation. Any unusual mark, scar, or blemish could be interpreted as evidence of supernatural activity, making conviction almost inevitable for any woman subjected to these examinations. Women's economic opportunities were severely limited and generally poorly compensated, reflecting their subordinate status in a society that viewed them as inherently inferior to men. The few occupations open to women were typically extensions of domestic work, textile production, food preparation, childcare, and domestic service, and even in these fields, the most skilled and lucrative positions were usually controlled by men. The guild system that dominated medieval commerce and manufacturing generally excluded women from membership, preventing them from practicing most skilled trades or advancing to positions of economic independence. Even in trades traditionally associated with women, such as brewing or textile work, the guild hierarchies were male-dominated, with women relegated to assistant roles regardless of their skill or experience. Women who worked outside the home typically earned much less than men for comparable work, and their earnings were often controlled by their husbands or fathers rather than being available for their own use. This economic dependence reinforced women's subordinate status and made it difficult for them to gain independence or improve their circumstances. Widows sometimes inherited businesses from their deceased husbands, but they often faced discrimination and hostility from male competitors who resented female participation in commerce. Guild regulations might limit widows' rights to continue their husband's business, requiring them to remarry within a certain period or face loss of their livelihood. Women's participation in agriculture was essential but largely unrecognized and uncompensated. Farm wives performed countless hours of labor in fields, gardens, and livestock management, but this work was considered part of their domestic duties rather than productive economic activity. Women's agricultural labor was invisible in economic terms, providing no independent income or social recognition. The legal restrictions on women's property ownership meant that even successful businesswomen could lose everything if they married, as their assets would automatically transfer to their husbands. This created a cruel paradox where marriage, the only socially acceptable role for women, also meant giving up whatever economic independence they might have achieved. Medical care for women was particularly primitive and dangerous, reflecting both the general inadequacy of medieval medicine and specific misconceptions about female biology. Women's health issues were often attributed to moral failings, supernatural influences, or the inherent weakness and inferiority of the female body rather than to medical causes. Gynecological problems were poorly understood and badly treated, with physicians often viewing women's reproductive systems as mysterious and threatening. Menstruation was seen as evidence of women's inherent corruption and spiritual weakness, leading to practices that isolated women during their periods and treated normal biological functions as shameful or dangerous. Contraception was primitive and often dangerous, consisting mainly of herbal remedies and folk practices that were usually ineffective and sometimes harmful. The lack of reliable birth control meant that sexual activity almost inevitably led to pregnancy, with all its attendant dangers, making women's sexuality inherently risky and potentially fatal. The medieval understanding of women's psychology was based on misogynistic stereotypes that portrayed women as inherently emotional, irrational, and morally weak. These beliefs influenced medical treatment, legal proceedings, and social interactions in ways that systematically disadvantaged women and justified their subordinate status. Mental health issues in women were typically attributed to female hysteria, possession by evil spirits, or moral corruption rather than to medical or psychological causes. Women suffering from depression, anxiety, or other mental health conditions received no effective treatment and were often subjected to exorcisms, physical punishment, or imprisonment that made their conditions worse. The social expectations for women required them to be constantly modest, obedient, deferential, and self-effacing. Any display of independence, intelligence, ambition, or strength could be seen as unwomanly and dangerous, leading to social punishment that ranged from ostracism to accusations of witchcraft. Women learned to minimize themselves and hide their abilities to avoid attracting negative attention. Intelligence had to be concealed, opinions had to be suppressed, and achievements had to be attributed to male guidance or assistance. The psychological cost of this constant self-suppression was enormous, but necessary for survival in a hostile social environment. The clothing regulations that applied to women were particularly restrictive and designed to emphasize their subordinate status. Women's clothing was required to be modest, covering, and restrictive of movement, making many activities difficult or impossible. The elaborate headdresses and long skirts worn by women of higher social classes were designed more to demonstrate their owners' wealth and status than to provide comfort or practicality. Religious life offered some alternatives to marriage for medieval women, but even convents were dominated by male authority and religious hierarchies that reinforced rather than challenged gender subordination. Nuns took vows of obedience not just to God but to male church authorities, and even the most powerful abbesses had to answer to bishops and other male religious officials. Convent life did provide some opportunities for education, intellectual development, and administrative responsibility that were unavailable to secular women. Some religious women became scholars, writers, mystics, and leaders within their communities. However, these opportunities came at the cost of giving up marriage, motherhood, and secular life entirely. The restrictions on women's mobility meant that most lived their entire lives within a very small geographical area, never traveling more than a few miles from where they were born. Women couldn't travel alone without risking accusations of improper behavior, and they rarely had reasons or opportunities for long-distance travel. This geographical isolation contributed to women's intellectual and cultural limitations, as they had limited exposure to new ideas, different perspectives, or opportunities for personal growth. Their world was confined to their immediate community, family relationships, and domestic responsibilities. Despite these overwhelming constraints and systematic oppression, some medieval women did manage to exercise agency and influence within the narrow confines of their society. Some became successful merchants, influential religious figures, powerful political actors behind the scenes, or skilled artisans who found ways to work within or around the restrictions placed on them. However, these were rare exceptions that proved the rule rather than evidence that the system was fair or just. The vast majority of medieval women lived and died in circumstances of systematic oppression, limited opportunities, and constant vulnerability that would be considered intolerable by modern standards. The life of a medieval woman was one of constant danger, legal disability, economic dependence, and social subordination. Whether noble or peasant, religious or secular, married or single, women faced restrictions and dangers that were specific to their gender and that made their lives fundamentally different from and more difficult than those of their male contemporaries. The medieval period represents one of the most systematically misogynistic eras in human history, when legal, religious, social, and economic structures combined to create a comprehensive system of female oppression. Understanding this history helps us appreciate how far women's rights have advanced and why continued vigilance is necessary to protect those gains. Chapter 7: Crime and Violence when Death Lurked Around Every Corner. Medieval society was incredibly violent, and we're not just talking about the occasional bar fight or domestic dispute. Violence was so endemic to daily life that the average person lived in constant fear of assault, robbery, murder, or worse. The very social structures that were supposed to maintain order often perpetrated the worst violence against innocent people, creating a world where survival required constant vigilance and the ability to defend yourself from both criminals and authorities. Let's start with simple theft, which was punishable by death in most medieval jurisdictions. But theft wasn't just about stealing someone's purse. The definition was so broad that almost any economic activity could be construed as theft by corrupt or malicious authorities looking for excuses to eliminate inconvenient people. Taking food from someone else's field, even if you were starving and the food would otherwise rot, was theft punishable by hanging. Gleaning leftover grain after harvest without explicit permission was theft. Picking up fallen branches from someone else's forest for firewood was theft. Even taking water from a stream that crossed someone's property could be considered theft in some jurisdictions. The penalties for these crimes were brutal and disproportionate to any harm caused. For stealing anything worth more than a few pence, roughly equivalent to a loaf of bread, you could be hanged, drawn, and quartered, or subjected to other forms of execution designed to maximize suffering and public spectacle. For lesser thefts, you might be branded, have your hands cut off, or be subjected to other mutilating punishments that would mark you as a criminal for life. But here's the truly horrifying part: false accusations of theft were common and often impossible to disprove. If a wealthy landowner claimed you had stolen from him, your word as a peasant carried no weight against his testimony. You could be executed based on nothing more than an accusation from someone who wanted to get rid of you, eliminate a romantic rival, or seize your property. The legal system provided no meaningful protection against false accusations, as the burden of proof was usually on the accused to prove their innocence rather than on the accuser to prove guilt. Without alibis, witnesses, or documentation that poor people couldn't afford to maintain, defending yourself against theft charges was nearly impossible. Property owners had enormous incentives to make false accusations against their neighbors, tenants, or workers. A successful theft conviction could result in the confiscation of the accused person's property, which would often be awarded to the accuser as compensation. This created a system where making false accusations was not just morally acceptable, but financially profitable. Highway robbery was a constant threat for anyone who traveled, and medieval roads were dangerous places where bandits operated with virtual impunity. These weren't romantic Robin Hood figures fighting injustice. They were desperate, violent criminals who would kill travelers for a few coins, a warm cloak, or even just their shoes. The isolation of medieval roads made them perfect hunting grounds for criminals. Most routes passed through sparsely populated areas where screams for help would go unheard and bodies could lie undiscovered for weeks or months. Travelers had to carry all their wealth with them, as there were no banks or safe ways to transfer money over long distances, making every journey a potentially fatal gamble. Bandits developed sophisticated techniques for identifying and targeting wealthy travelers. They would station lookouts at inns and markets to identify potential victims, then waylay them at carefully chosen ambush points where escape was impossible. River crossings, mountain passes, and forest clearings were favorite locations for attacks. The authorities' response to highway robbery was often as dangerous as the crime itself. Rather than investing in regular patrols or road security, they would often arrest random suspicious-looking people and execute them as examples. Being in the wrong place at the wrong time, carrying unusual goods, or simply looking like you didn't belong could cost you your life even if you had never committed a crime. Sheriffs and other law enforcement officials were often corrupt and sometimes working directly with the bandits they were supposed to catch. Some authorities would tip off criminal gangs about wealthy travelers or valuable shipment in exchange for a share of the profits. Others would offer protection services that were really extortion schemes. Urban violence was even worse than rural banditry. Medieval cities were crowded, poorly lit, and filled with desperate people competing for limited resources. Street violence was constant, and murder rates in medieval cities were 10–20 times higher than in modern urban areas, even including today's most dangerous cities. The narrow, winding streets of medieval cities created countless opportunities for ambushes and attacks. Buildings were built close together with numerous dark alleyways and dead ends where criminals could corner their victims. The lack of street lighting meant that most urban areas were pitch black after sunset, providing perfect cover for violent crimes. Gangs controlled many urban neighborhoods, collecting tribute from residents and businesses while terrorizing anyone who refused to pay. These weren't organized crime families with codes of honor or sophisticated hierarchies. They were loose groups of thugs who used violence to extract whatever they could from anyone weaker than themselves. The economic desperation that characterized medieval urban life created huge populations of people who had nothing to lose and everything to gain from crime. Unemployed workers, displaced peasants, disabled veterans, and other marginalized groups often turned to violence as their only means of survival. Weapons were commonly carried by most men, as personal protection was a necessity in such a violent society. Knives, clubs, swords, and other weapons were tools of daily life that could quickly become instruments of violence. Minor disputes could escalate to deadly confrontations within seconds, and the widespread availability of weapons made every argument potentially fatal. The concept of professional policing didn't exist in most medieval cities. Law enforcement was the responsibility of part-time watchmen, corrupt sheriffs, and volunteer militias who were often outnumbered, outgunned, and intimidated by the criminals they were supposed to control. Many law enforcement officials were criminals themselves, using their positions to extort money and abuse their authority. Night watchmen were typically elderly, disabled, or otherwise unfit for regular employment, making them easy targets for the criminals they were supposed to deter. These guards were often drunk, asleep, or simply absent from their posts, leaving entire neighborhoods unprotected during the most dangerous hours. The few attempts at organized crime fighting were usually brutal and indiscriminate, involving mass arrests, torture, and executions that targeted innocent people along with actual criminals. Authorities would sometimes raid entire neighborhoods, arresting everyone who seemed suspicious and sorting out guilt or innocence later, if at all. Prisons were primarily holding facilities for people awaiting trial or execution, not long-term punishment facilities. This meant that convicted criminals were usually executed, mutilated, or released back into the community. There was no concept of rehabilitation or long-term incarceration to protect society from dangerous individuals. The justice system's reliance on brutal public punishment created a culture that celebrated and normalized extreme violence. Public executions, floggings, and mutilations were community entertainment events that drew large crowds of men, women, and children. These spectacles taught everyone that violence was not only acceptable but worthy of celebration. Children grew up watching people being tortured and killed in public squares, normalizing extreme violence as part of everyday life. This early exposure to brutality created adults who were desensitized to suffering and more likely to use violence to solve their own problems. Private vendettas and blood feuds were common and often lasted for generations, creating cycles of violence that could devastate entire communities. If someone wronged your family, you were expected to seek revenge, leading to back and forth killings that sometimes continued for decades. The legal system provided little protection from these personal wars, as authorities were often reluctant to get involved in what they saw as private matters between families. This created a parallel system of justice where might made right, and the most violent families dominated their communities through intimidation and murder. Domestic violence wasn't just tolerated, it was legally sanctioned and socially expected. Husbands were required to control their wives and children through physical discipline, and neighbors would intervene only if the violence seemed excessive by medieval standards, which were far more permissive than modern ones. The normalization of domestic violence created homes that were often more dangerous than the streets. Women and children lived in constant fear of beatings, and many died from injuries inflicted by their own family members. The legal system treated these deaths as accidents or justified punishments rather than crimes. Sexual violence was endemic and rarely punished, reflecting the low value placed on women's lives and bodily autonomy. Women and children had little protection from assault, and the legal system treated rape more as a property crime against the victim's male relatives than as a serious offense against the victim herself. Rape laws were designed to protect men's property rights rather than women's safety. A rapist might be punished for damaging another man's property, but not for harming the woman herself. In many cases, rapists could escape punishment entirely by marrying their victims, which was seen as making amends for the damage they had caused. The prevalence of alcohol made violence even more common and more dangerous. Most people drank beer or ale throughout the day because water was unsafe, and public drunkenness was normal. Alcohol-fueled violence was a daily occurrence in taverns, markets, and streets throughout medieval Europe. Taverns were particularly dangerous places where fights could break out over trivial matters and quickly escalate to deadly violence. The combination of alcohol, weapons, dim lighting, and combustible social tensions made these establishments extremely hazardous for both patrons and workers. Military violence spilled over into civilian life constantly, as professional soldiers often turned to banditry and extortion when not engaged in formal warfare. Standing armies were expensive and difficult to maintain, so soldiers were often dismissed at the end of campaigns and left to fend for themselves through whatever means necessary. Mercenary companies, which provided military services to the highest bidder, would terrorize countryside populations when not employed in official campaigns. These armed groups would demand food, money, and shelter at sword point, essentially conducting organized raids against civilian populations. The feudal system's emphasis on martial prowess glorified violence and made it the primary means of resolving disputes between powerful people. Knights and nobles solved their problems through combat, setting an example that trickled down through all levels of society and normalized violence as the preferred method of conflict resolution. Trial by combat allowed disputants to settle legal cases through fighting, with the winner presumed to be in the right regardless of the actual facts of the case. This system regularly resulted in innocent people dying because they were poor fighters or couldn't afford competent champions to fight for them. Religious violence was common and officially sanctioned by church and secular authorities. Heretics were burned alive, Jews were massacred during periods of religious hysteria, and crusades brought organized violence to entire regions. Even minor religious disagreements could lead to mob violence and murder. The Church's doctrine of just war provided religious justification for almost any form of violence that served the interests of Christian authorities. This created a culture where violence in the name of religion was not just acceptable but morally praiseworthy, leading to countless atrocities committed in God's name. Economic violence was systematic and legal, built into the very structure of medieval society. Debt collection involved physical intimidation and assault. Landlords could use violence to evict tenants or collect rents. Employers could beat workers who were unsatisfactory or disobedient without legal consequences. The guild system used violence to maintain monopolies and suppress competition. Guild members would physically attack non-members who tried to practice protected trades, and guild enforcers would destroy equipment and merchandise belonging to unauthorized competitors. The lack of effective communication meant that crimes often went unreported and unpunished. A murder in a remote village might never be investigated by higher authorities, and criminals could escape justice simply by moving to a different region where they weren't known. Record keeping was so poor that repeat offenders could easily hide their criminal histories by moving to new locations. Without fingerprinting, photography, or central databases, identifying criminals was nearly impossible once they left their home communities. Legal procedures themselves were violent and traumatic, designed more to extract confessions through torture than to determine guilt or innocence through evidence. The assumption was that torture would force guilty people to confess while innocent people would maintain their innocence despite the pain. Torture techniques were sophisticated and specifically designed to maximize pain while keeping victims alive and conscious for extended periods. Professional torturers developed expertise in human anatomy and pain tolerance that allowed them to keep people alive and suffering for days or weeks. The psychological effects of living in such a violent society were severe but largely unrecognized. People suffered from what we would now call PTSD, but medieval society had no understanding of psychological trauma or treatment for its effects. The constant stress of violence created mental health problems that were often mistaken for moral weakness or demonic possession. The culture of honor that dominated medieval society meant that perceived slights could lead to deadly confrontations. A casual insult, an accidental bumping, or failure to show proper deference could result in violence. Men were expected to defend their honor through physical force, regardless of the consequences. Women faced additional layers of violence specific to their gender and their vulnerable position in society. They could be beaten for talking back, for failing in their domestic duties, for being too friendly with other men, or for any behavior that men found objectionable. The line between discipline and abuse didn't exist in medieval thinking. Violence against women was so normalized that it was often used as entertainment. Public punishments for women accused of various crimes drew large crowds who enjoyed watching female victims suffer. These spectacles reinforced gender hierarchies while providing sadistic entertainment for the masses. Children were subject to extreme violence from parents, teachers, employers, and strangers. Child abuse was not recognized as a problem, and children had no legal protections from adults who wanted to harm them. Many children died from beatings that were considered normal discipline by medieval standards. The military draft could force men into violent conflicts against their will, conscripting peasants to fight in wars that had nothing to do with their interests. These unwilling soldiers faced death or permanent disability in service to lords who cared nothing about their welfare. War itself was conducted with a brutality that would shock modern sensibilities. Armies would deliberately target civilian populations, destroying crops, burning villages, and massacring non-combatants. Prisoners of war were often tortured, enslaved, or executed rather than being treated according to any rules of civilized warfare. The constant threat of violence shaped every aspect of medieval life. People planned their daily activities around avoiding dangerous areas and situations. Social interactions were constrained by the need to avoid giving offense that could lead to violent retaliation. Business transactions were complicated by the need for physical protection and the constant threat of robbery or extortion. Trade was dangerous and expensive, as merchants had to hire guards and pay protection money to various authorities and criminal organizations along their routes. The normalization of violence created a society where cruelty was not just accepted but expected and celebrated. People who showed mercy or compassion were often seen as weak and became targets for exploitation. Survival required developing a hot, ruthless attitude that prioritized personal safety over moral considerations. Mental health problems caused by exposure to constant violence were widespread but completely unrecognized. People suffered from what we would now call PTSD, anxiety disorders, and other trauma-related conditions, but medieval society had no understanding of psychological trauma or methods for treating its effects. The cycle of violence was self-perpetuating and seemingly endless. Children who grew up witnessing and experiencing violence became adults who used violence to solve their own problems. Communities that relied on violence for social control created more violent individuals who required even more violent suppression. In this environment, every day was a potential life or death struggle. The modern concept of personal safety and security simply didn't exist. You lived with the knowledge that violence could strike at any moment from any direction, and that there was little you could do to protect yourself or your loved ones from the predators, both criminal and legal, who dominated medieval society. The statistical reality of medieval violence is staggering. Murder rates in medieval cities were 50 times higher than in modern developed countries. Assault, robbery, and other violent crimes were so common that they were considered normal parts of daily life. The average medieval person witnessed more violence in a year than most modern people see in their entire lifetimes. Chapter 8: Travel and Transportation. Every journey could be your last. In our modern world, we complain about flight delays and traffic jams. In medieval times, travel was so dangerous that many people never ventured more than 5 miles from where they were born. And for good reason. Every journey, no matter how short, was potentially fatal and required careful planning, adequate resources, and considerable luck to complete successfully. Let's start with the roads themselves, or rather, the lack thereof. Most medieval roads were nothing more than dirt tracks that had been worn down by foot traffic and wagon wheels over centuries of use. During dry weather, these paths were dusty, rutted, and filled with holes that could break a horse's leg or overturn a cart. During wet weather, they became impassable quagmires of mud that could swallow a horse and rider whole. Famous Roman roads that still existed in some areas were crumbling and poorly maintained. Local authorities had neither the resources nor the incentive to keep roads in good repair. After all, good roads might encourage unwanted visitors, including armies, bandits, and tax collectors who could cause more problems than they solved. Road maintenance was the responsibility of local communities, but peasants were too busy trying to survive to spend time and resources on infrastructure that primarily benefited travelers from elsewhere. The result was a transportation network that deteriorated steadily throughout the medieval period, making travel increasingly difficult and dangerous. Bridges were rare and often in terrible condition. Most rivers had to be crossed at fords, which were dangerous during high water and sometimes impossible to locate in unfamiliar territory. Many travelers drowned attempting river crossings, including some rather important people. Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa famously drowned crossing a relatively small river during the Third Crusade. When bridges did exist, they were often privately owned and heavily taxed. Bridge owners could charge whatever they wanted, and travelers had no choice but to pay or find another route that might add days or weeks to their journey. Some bridge tolls were so high that they bankrupted travelers or forced them to turn back, abandoning their journeys entirely. Navigation was primitive and unreliable. There were no accurate maps available to ordinary people, and even those that existed were often wildly incorrect, based more on hearsay and imagination than on actual geographical knowledge. Travelers relied on verbal directions from locals who might be mistaken, malicious, or simply trying to direct traffic away from their communities. Getting lost was easy and potentially fatal. Without landmarks or reliable directions, travelers could wander for days in unfamiliar territory, using up precious supplies while making no progress toward their destinations. During winter, getting lost meant almost certain death from exposure. Even in good weather, being lost meant going without food and water while burning through resources needed for the journey. The speed of travel was painfully slow by modern standards. A person on foot could cover maybe 50 minutes, 20 miles per day under ideal conditions, good weather, decent roads, no delays or complications. On horseback, you might manage 25 minutes, 30 miles if you had a good horse and favorable terrain. But these were best-case scenarios that rarely occurred in practice. Bad weather, rough terrain, mechanical problems, illness, or encounters with bandits could reduce progress to just a few miles per day or stop travel entirely for days or weeks. A journey that should have taken a week might take a month if conditions were poor or complications arose. Horses were expensive to buy and maintain, putting them beyond the reach of most ordinary people. A good traveling horse cost as much as a modern car and required daily care, food, and shelter that added significantly to travel expenses. Most people who needed to travel had to walk, making even short journeys into multi-day ordeals that tested their endurance and resources. For those who could afford horses, the animals brought their own dangers and complications. Horses could go lame, throw their riders, or simply die from overexertion, disease, or accidents. Being stranded on foot in the wilderness because your horse died was a death sentence for many travelers who lacked the supplies or skills to survive on their own. The care and feeding of horses during travel required extensive planning and resources. Horses needed large quantities of food and water that had to be carried or obtained along the route. Finding adequate grazing and shelter for horses often determined where travelers could stop and how long they could stay in each location. Accommodation for travelers was scarce and dangerous. Inns existed in some areas, but they were often no better than the hovels that local peasants lived in. You might share a bed with strangers, including people with infectious diseases. Food was often spoiled, and the ale was watered down or contaminated with dangerous substances. Many inns were actually fronts for criminal operations. Innkeepers might drug travelers and rob them, or work with highwaymen to identify wealthy victims and provide information about their routes and resources. Some inns were notorious murder sites where guests regularly disappeared without a trace, their possessions stolen and their bodies disposed of in unmarked graves. In areas without inns, travelers had to sleep outdoors or beg for shelter from local residents who were often suspicious of strangers and reluctant to provide assistance. Sleeping in the open exposed you to weather, wild animals, and human predators who might rob, assault, or kill vulnerable travelers. Weather was an implacable enemy of medieval travelers. Rain could make roads impassable and destroy supplies. Snow could bury roads entirely and make navigation impossible. Heat could cause dehydration and heat stroke. Storms could bring lightning, floods, and other deadly hazards that killed travelers without warning. Winter travel was particularly dangerous and often impossible. Snow and ice made roads treacherous for both horses and pedestrians. Rivers and streams could freeze, creating new hazards for travelers who expected to find water or who needed to cross ice that might not support their weight. Shorter days meant more travel in darkness, when accidents and attacks were more likely. Food and water procurement during travel was always problematic. Travelers had to carry their own supplies or hope to buy food along the way from people who might not have surplus to sell. Water sources were often contaminated with human and animal waste, and there was no reliable way to purify water to make it safe to drink. Many travelers died from dysentery and other waterborne diseases contracted during their journeys. The combination of contaminated water, spoiled food, and the stress of travel created perfect conditions for illness that could kill healthy people within days of onset. Carrying supplies made travelers more attractive targets for robbers, but was absolutely necessary for survival. The weight of food, water, cooking equipment, and basic camping gear made travel slower and more exhausting. Pack animals could help carry supplies, but they were expensive, required care and feeding, and created additional complications for travelers. Legal problems could arise in different jurisdictions along travel routes. Laws varied dramatically from one region to another, and travelers might unknowingly break local ordinances that carried severe penalties. Being a foreigner provided no protection and often made you more suspicious to local authorities who might see outsiders as potential threats or sources of revenue through fines and confiscation. Currency exchange was complicated and expensive throughout medieval Europe. Different regions used different money systems, and exchanging currency usually involved significant losses to money changers who were often dishonest or corrupt. Travelers could arrive at their destinations with much less wealth than they started with, simply due to currency conversion costs and fraudulent exchange rates. Language barriers made communication difficult and dangerous. Even within the same country, regional dialects could be mutually unintelligible. Misunderstandings could lead to violence, legal problems, or simply being unable to get the help and information needed to complete a journey safely. Women traveling alone faced additional dangers, including sexual assault and accusations of improper behavior. Most women couldn't travel without male escorts, which meant they were dependent on men who might themselves be dangerous or unreliable. The few women who did travel alone were assumed to be prostitutes or criminals and faced constant harassment and suspicion. Merchant caravans offered some protection through numbers but created their own risks and complications. Large groups of travelers moved slowly and attracted attention from bandits who saw valuable cargo and wealthy merchants as profitable targets. Internal conflicts within caravans could lead to violence, abandonment, or theft by fellow travelers. The goods being transported in merchant caravans made them particularly attractive targets for organized crime. Bandits would sometimes follow caravans for days, waiting for opportunities to attack when the group was vulnerable or separated. The value of trade goods also created temptations for corruption among guards and caravan members. Sea travel was faster than overland routes, but much more dangerous for those who could afford it. Medieval ships were small, poorly constructed, and vulnerable to storms that could sink them without warning. Navigation was primitive, relying on coastlines and basic astronomical observations that were often inadequate for safe ocean travel. Many ships were lost at sea without any trace, leaving families to wonder forever what had happened to their loved ones. Piracy was common in most waters, and pirates showed no mercy to passengers or crew, often killing everyone aboard to eliminate witnesses after stealing cargo and valuables. Even successful journeys took enormous tolls on travelers' health and resources. Physical exertion, poor nutrition, exposure to weather, and constant stress of dangerous travel left many people permanently weakened or damaged. Some travelers survived their journeys but died shortly after arrival from the accumulated health damage of weeks or months on the road. The psychological stress of medieval travel was intense and long-lasting. Travelers lived with constant fear of attack, accident, disease, and death throughout their journeys. Many people who attempted long journeys developed what we would now recognize as anxiety disorders or PTSD from their travel experiences. Communication during travel was nearly impossible. If something went wrong, there was no way to send word to family or business associates about delays, problems, or changes in plans. Many commercial ventures failed because key people disappeared while traveling, leaving their affairs in chaos and their partners unable to continue without them. The unpredictability of travel made planning almost impossible. A journey that should have taken a week might take a month if weather, bandits, illness, or mechanical problems intervened. This uncertainty made medieval commerce and communication incredibly difficult and unreliable, limiting economic development and social connections. For most medieval people, the dangers of travel far outweighed any potential benefits. Only the wealthy, desperate, or foolhardy attempted long journeys with any regularity. The vast majority of the population lived and died within a few miles of where they were born, prisoners of a transportation system that was more likely to kill them than deliver them safely to their destinations. The few people who did travel regularly, merchants, soldiers, clergy, and government officials, developed specialized knowledge and resources that helped them survive, but even these experienced travelers faced constant dangers and high mortality rates. Travel was an occupational hazard that claimed many lives and left survivors scarred by their experiences. Chapter 9. Conclusion: Why Modern Life is a Miracle. After this journey through the horrors of medieval life, you should be on your knees thanking whatever deity you believe in that you were born in the 21st century. Every single aspect of modern life that you take for granted, from the clean water that flows from your tap to the antibiotics that cure your infections, represents centuries of human progress that have lifted us out of the medieval nightmare and into a world of unprecedented comfort, safety, and opportunity. Think about your morning routine for a moment. You wake up in a comfortable bed with clean sheets, in a house with solid walls and a weatherproof roof. You flip a switch and light floods the room instantly. You turn a handle and clean, safe water flows out at whatever temperature you desire. You open a refrigerator full of fresh, safe food from around the world. You use a private bathroom with modern plumbing that removes waste safely and hygienically. Every single one of these simple acts would have been impossible for 99% of medieval humanity. They would have seemed like magic, like the powers of gods, rather than the everyday conveniences available to ordinary people. The technology and infrastructure that make your morning routine possible represent thousands of years of human innovation and social development. Your smartphone contains more computing power than entire medieval kingdoms could have imagined. You can communicate instantly with people anywhere in the world, access the sum total of human knowledge with a few taps of your finger, navigate with precision to any location on Earth, and document your life in ways that medieval people couldn't have dreamed of. The medical care available to you would seem like miraculous healing to medieval people. Antibiotics can cure infections that killed millions of our ancestors. Vaccines prevent diseases that terrorized entire civilizations for centuries. Surgery can repair injuries that would have been automatic death sentences in medieval times. Even basic first aid supplies from your medicine cabinet represent medical technology more advanced than anything available to medieval royalty. Your legal rights and protections are so far beyond medieval concepts of justice that they might as well be from another universe entirely. You have the right to a fair trial with legal representation, protection from cruel and unusual punishment, due process of law, and presumption of innocence. You can be executed for stealing food when you're hungry, tortured to extract confessions, or punished for crimes you didn't commit based on the accusations of more powerful people. The social mobility available to you is unprecedented in human history. You can choose your own career path, marry whom you want to marry, live where you choose to live, and determine your own future through your decisions and efforts. Your birth circumstances don't determine your entire life trajectory, and you have opportunities for advancement and self-improvement that would have been unthinkable to medieval people trapped in rigid social hierarchies. Women in modern society have rights and freedoms that medieval women couldn't have imagined in their wildest dreams. You can own property, pursue education and careers, choose your own spouse or remain single, have control over your own body and reproductive choices, and participate fully in political and economic life. The systematic oppression that defined women's lives for centuries has largely been swept away in the developed world. The food security you enjoy is almost incomprehensible from a medieval perspective. You've probably never worried about starving to death, never eaten moldy bread because it was all you had available, never watched children die of malnutrition. The variety, safety, and abundance of modern food would seem like the feast halls of heaven to medieval people who lived with constant hunger and food insecurity. Transportation that seemed impossibly dangerous to our ancestors is now routine and remarkably safe. You can travel hundreds of miles in a few hours with almost no risk of death, robbery, or getting lost. You can cross oceans in comfort and safety, communicate during travel, and arrive at your destination with your health and wealth intact. The education available to you far exceeds what was available to medieval nobility and royalty. You can learn about any subject that interests you, develop skills that suit your aptitude and inclinations, and acquire knowledge that gives you power over your own life and circumstances. The literacy that was reserved for a tiny elite is now considered a basic requirement for all citizens. Your work, however challenging or frustrating it might sometimes seem, doesn't involve the back-breaking physical labor that killed our ancestors young. You work in safe conditions with legal protections, reasonable hours, and compensation that allows you to live with dignity and security. You can quit jobs you don't like and find new ones without facing starvation or homelessness. The entertainment and leisure activities available to you would seem like royal luxury to medieval people who had no access to books, movies, music, sports, or countless other diversions that can enrich your life and expand your horizons. You have time for hobbies, travel, and personal development that would have been unthinkable to people struggling simply to survive from day to day. Even your problems and challenges, real and significant as they may be, pale in comparison to the daily life or death struggles of medieval existence. You worry about career advancement, relationship issues, financial planning, and personal fulfillment, not about dying from infected cuts, starving to death, or being executed for minor infractions of arbitrary laws. The environmental quality of your life is so much better than medieval conditions that meaningful comparisons are difficult to make. You breathe clean air, drink safe water, and live in spaces that aren't filled with smoke, animal waste, and human filth. The chronic diseases caused by medieval environmental conditions have largely disappeared from the developed world. Your life expectancy is more than double what it was in medieval times, and those extra years are generally healthy, productive years rather than a prolonged decline into infirmity and helplessness. You can expect to see your children grow up, have grandchildren, and enjoy a long retirement that would have been impossible for our ancestors. The security you enjoy, both physical and economic, allows you to plan for the future in ways that medieval people couldn't imagine. You can save money, invest in education and skills, build careers, and make long-term commitments because you live in a stable society with functioning institutions that protect your rights and property. Your individual worth and dignity are recognized and protected in ways that were revolutionary in human history. You have inherent rights that can't be taken away by accidents of birth, gender, or social class. You are valued as a human being rather than as property, livestock, or a unit of labor to be exploited by your social superiors. The scientific knowledge that shapes your world has eliminated most of the ignorance and superstition that made medieval life so dangerous and unpredictable. You understand disease, weather, agriculture, and countless other phenomena that seemed magical and terrifying to our ancestors who lacked basic scientific knowledge. The social safety nets available to you, however imperfect they might be, provide security that medieval people never had. You have access to emergency services, disaster relief and employment assistance, healthcare systems, and other programs that prevent the kind of catastrophic personal disasters that regularly destroyed medieval lives. Your freedom to think, speak, and believe what you choose represents centuries of struggle against the authoritarianism and oppression that characterized medieval society. You can question authority, express dissent, participate in governance, and live according to your own values in ways that would have gotten our ancestors tortured or killed. The diversity and tolerance of modern society, while still imperfect and evolving, allows people of different backgrounds, beliefs, and lifestyles to coexist peacefully. The religious conflicts, ethnic hatreds, and social prejudices that made medieval society so violent and oppressive have largely been overcome in developed nations. The technological tools available to you amplify human capability in ways that give you powers that medieval people would have attributed to gods or magic. You can travel faster than the fastest horse, communicate across any distance instantly, access information that would have taken medieval scholars lifetimes to gather, and accomplish tasks that would have required armies of workers in the past. Your children have opportunities and protections that represent the hopes and dreams of countless generations of parents who couldn't provide such advantages. They can expect to live long, healthy, productive lives with choices and freedoms that were unimaginable to medieval children who faced lives of predetermined servitude and struggle. So the next time you feel frustrated with modern life, remember where we came from. Remember the plague-infested hovels, the contaminated food, the brutal justice systems, the systematic oppression, and the constant fear that defined daily existence for most of human history. Remember that your ancestors lived and died in conditions that would horrify you, not because they were inferior people, but because they lacked the knowledge, technology, and social institutions that make your comfortable life possible. You are living in the most privileged time in human history, enjoying benefits that kings and emperors of the past could never have imagined. You have won the lottery of time and place by being born into a world that has conquered most of the ancient enemies of human happiness and prosperity. Medieval life wasn't romantic, adventurous, or noble. It was a nightmare of suffering, ignorance, and premature death that claimed the lives of billions of people who deserved better. We honor their memory not by romanticizing their suffering, but by appreciating how far we've come and working to ensure that such conditions never return to plague humanity again. The progress that has lifted humanity out of medieval darkness didn't happen by accident or divine intervention. It was achieved through the efforts of countless individuals who fought against ignorance, oppression, and despair. Every freedom you enjoy, every comfort you experience, every opportunity you have represents someone's struggle to make the world better than they found it. That progress is not guaranteed to continue, and it could be reversed if we are not careful to protect and nurture the institutions, values, and knowledge that make modern life possible. The medieval world reminds us what happens when societies fail, when knowledge is lost, when institutions collapse, and when people stop working together for the common good. Your life in the 21st century is not just comfortable, it's miraculous. You are living proof that humanity can overcome its darkest impulses and create societies that value human dignity, individual freedom, and shared prosperity. You have inherited a world that medieval people could only dream of, and you have the responsibility to preserve and extend that inheritance to future generations. So yes, you definitely wouldn't survive a day in medieval times. But more importantly, you don't have to. Thanks to centuries of human progress, you get to live in a world where the medieval nightmare is just history, a reminder of how far we've come and how grateful we should be for the miracle of modern civilization. The next time someone suggests that things were better in the good old days, remind them that there were no good old days for the vast majority of human beings. The present, for all its problems and challenges, is the best time in human history to be alive. Medieval life would have killed you in a day, but modern life gives you the chance to thrive for decades in ways that our ancestors never could have imagined. That's not just something to be grateful for, it's something to protect, defend, and improve upon. Because if we ever forget how brutal life can be without modern institutions, knowledge, and values, we might find ourselves sliding back toward the darkness that once claimed so many of our ancestors. Your comfortable, safe, healthy modern life is not just a lucky accident, it's the greatest achievement in human history. And now that you know what came before it, you can truly appreciate the miracle of being alive today. You've made it to the end. That means you survived this brutal journey through medieval life with us. If you found this dark tale enlightening, please consider subscribing to our channel, Lazy Historian, and give this video a thumbs up. I truly appreciate every one of you for watching and joining me on this journey through history's harsh realities. Remember, every comfort we enjoy today came from centuries of human struggle and progress. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.